19 repeats, "My lady, thoughtfully take care they don't spoil you by flattery." Yes, my lady taps her dimpled cheek with the same delicate gloved fingers and goes on to the foot of the oak staircase, where Celeste pauses for her as her nightly escort a staring old deadlock in a panel as large as life, and as dull looks as if he didn't know what to make of it, which was probably his general state of mind in the days of Queen Elizabeth. That evening in the housekeeper's room, Rosa can do nothing but murmur Lady Dedlock's praises. She is so affable, so graceful, so beautiful, so elegant, has such a sweet voice and such a thrilling touch that Rosa can feel it. Yet Mrs. Rouncil confirms all this, not without personal pride, reserving only the one point of affability. Mrs. Ransom is not quite sure as to that. Heaven forbid that she should say a syllable in dispraise of any member of that excellent family, above all of my lady, whom the whole world admires. But if my lady would only be a little more free, not quite so cold and distant. Mrs. Rouncewell thinks she would be more affable. 'Tis almost a pity, Mrs. Rouncewell adds, only almost, because it borders on impiety to suppose that anything could be better than it is in such an express dispensation as the Dedlock affairs. But my lady has no family. If she had had a daughter, now a grown young lady, to interest her, I think she would have had the only kind of excellence she wants, might not that have made her still more proud. Grandmother says, "What, who has been home and come back again? He is such a good grandson, more and most, my dear," returns the housekeeper with dignity. "Our words it's not my place to use, nor so much as to hear applied to any drawback on my lady. I beg your pardon, grandmother, but she is proud, is she not? If she is, she has reason to be. The Dedlock family have always reason to be." Well, says Watt, it's to be hoped they line out of their prayer books a certain passage for the common people about pride and vain glory. "Forgive me, grandmother, only a joke. Sir Leicester and Lady Dedlock, my dear, are not fit subjects for joking." "Celeste is no joke by any means," says Watt, "and I humbly ask his pardon. I suppose, grandmother, that even with the family and their guests down here, there is no objection to my prolonging my stay at the Dedlock Arms for a day or two, as any other traveler might." "Surely none in the world, child." "I am glad of that," says Watt, "because I have an inexpressible desire to extend my knowledge of this beautiful neighborhood." He happens to glance at Rosa, who looks down and is very shy indeed. But according to the old superstition, it should be Rosa's ears that burn, and not her fresh bright cheeks, for my lady's maid is holding forth about her at this moment with surpassing energy. My lady's maid is a French woman of 32, from somewhere in the southern country about Avignon and Marseille, a large-eyed brown woman with black hair, who would be handsome but for a certain feline mouth and general uncomfortable tightness of face, rendering the jaws too eager and the skull too prominent. There is something indefinably keen and won about her anatomy, and she has a watchful way of looking out of the corners of her eyes without turning her head, which could be pleasantly dispensed with, especially when she is in an ill humor and near knives. Through all the good taste of her dress and little adornments, these objections so express themselves that she seems to go about like a very neat she-wolf, imperfectly tamed, besides being accomplished in all the knowledge appertaining to her post. She is almost an English woman in her acquaintance with the language. Consequently, she is in no want of words to shower upon Rosa for having attracted my lady's attention, and she pours them out with such grim ridicule as she sits at dinner that her companion, the affectionate man, is rather relieved when she arrives at the spoon stage of that performance. Ha ha ha! She, Hortense, has been in my lady's service since 5 years, and always kept at the distance, and this doll, this puppet, caressed, absolutely caressed by my lady on the moment of her arriving at the house. Ha ha ha! And do you know how pretty you are, child? No, my lady, you are right there. And how old are you, child? And take care they do not spoil you by flattery, child. Oh, how droll! It is the best thing altogether. In short, it is such an admirable thing that Mademoiselle Hortense can't forget it, but at meals for days afterwards, even among her countrywomen and others attached in like capacity to the troop of visitors, relapses into silent enjoyment of the joke, and enjoyment expressed in her own convivial manner by an additional tightness of face, thin elongation of compressed lips, and sideways look, which intense appreciation of humor is frequently reflected in my lady's mirrors. When my lady is not among them, all the mirrors in the house are brought into action now, many of them after a long blank. They reflect handsome faces, simpering faces, youthful faces, faces of 70, that will not submit to be old the entire collection of faces that have come to pass a January week or two at Chesney Wold, and which, the fashionable intelligence a mighty hunter, before the Lord hunts with a keen scent from their breaking cover at the court of St. James's to their being run down to death the place in Lincolnshire, is all alive by day guns, and voices are heard ringing in the woods, horsemen and carriages and live on the park roads, servants and hangers-on pervade the village, and the deadlock arms seen by night from distant openings in the trees, the row of windows, and the long drawing room where my lady's picture hangs over the great chimney piece is like a row of jewels set in a black frame on Sunday. The chill little church is almost warmed by so much gallant company, and the general flavor of the deadlock dust is quenched. In delicate perfumes the brilliant and distinguished circle comprehends within it no contracted amount of education, sense, courage, honor, beauty, and virtue. Yet there is something a little wrong about it in despite of its immense advantages. What can it be? Dandism. There is no King George IV now, more the pity to set the dandy fashion. There are no clear stark jacketile neckcloths, no short-waisted coats, no false calves, no stays. There are no caricatures now of effeminate exquisites arrayed swooning in opera boxes with excessive delight, and being revived by other dainty creatures, poking long-necked scent bottles at their noses. There's no beau whom it takes for men at once to shake into his buckskins, or who goes to see all the executions, or who is troubled with the self-reproach of having once consumed a pea. But is there dandism in the brilliant and distinguished circle, notwithstanding dandism of a more mischievous sort, that has got below the surface and is doing less harmless things than jack toiling itself and stopping its own digestion, to which no rational person need particularly object? Why, yes, it cannot be disguised. There are at Chesney Wold this January week some ladies and gentlemen of the newest fashion who have set up a dandism in religion, for instance, who in mere lackadaisical want of an emotion have agreed upon a little dandy talk about the vulgar wanting faith in things in general meaning in the things that have been tried and found wanting, as though a low fellow should unaccountably lose faith in a bad shilling after finding it out, who would make the vulgar very picturesque and faithful by putting back the hands upon the clock of time and cancelling a few hundred years of history. There are also ladies and gentlemen of another fashion, not so new, but very elegant, who have agreed to put a smooth glaze on the world, and to keep down all its realities, for whom everything must be languid and pretty, who have found out the perpetual stoppage, who are to rejoice at nothing and be sorry for nothing, who are not to be disturbed by ideas, on whom even the fine arts attending in powder and walking backward like the Lord Chamberlain must array themselves in the milliners' and tailors' patterns of past generations, and be particularly careful not to be in earnest or to receive any impress from the moving age. Then there is my Lord Doodle of considerable reputation with his party, who is known what office is, and who tells Celesta Dedlock with much gravity after dinner that he really does not see to what the present age is tending. A debate is not what a debate used to be. The House is not what the House used to be. Even a cabinet is not what it formerly was. He perceives with astonishment that, supposing the present government to be overthrown, the limited choice of the Crown in the formation of a new ministry would lie between Lord Coodle and Sir Thomas Doodle, supposing it to be impossible for the Duke of Foodle to act with Goodle, which may be assumed to be the case in consequence of the breach arising out of that affair, with Goodle then giving the Home Department and the leadership of the House of Commons to Juddle, the Exchequer to Coodle, the colonies to Luddle, and the Foreign Office to Moodle. What are you to do with Noodle? You can't offer him the presidency of the council that is reserved for Poodle. You can't put him in the woods and forests that is hardly good enough for Poodle. What follows that the country is shipwrecked, lost, and gone to pieces, as is made manifest to the patriotism of Celeste Dedlock, because you can't provide for Noodle. On the other hand, the Right Honorable William Buffy MP contends across the table with someone else that the shipwreck of the country, about which there is no doubt it is only the manner of it that is in question, is attributable to Cuffy. If you had done with Cuffy what you ought to have done when he first came into Parliament, and had prevented him from going over to Duffy, you would have got him into alliance with Fluffy. You would have had with you the weight attaching as a smart debater to Guffy. You would have brought to bear upon the elections the wealth of Huffy. You would have got in for 3 counties Juffy, Cuffy, and Luffy, and you would have strengthened your administration by the official knowledge and the business habits of Muffy, all this instead of being as you now are dependent on the mere caprice of Puffy. As to this point, and as to some minor topics, there are differences of opinion. But it is perfectly clear to the brilliant and distinguished circle all round that nobody is in question but Boodle and his retinue and Buffy and his retinue. These are the great actors for whom the stage is reserved. A people, there are no doubt a certain large number of supernumeraries who are to be occasionally addressed and relied upon for shouts and choruses as on the theatrical stage. But Boodle and Buffy, their followers and families, their heirs, executors, administrators, and assigns, are the born first actors, managers, and leaders, and no others can appear upon the scene forever and ever. In this too there is perhaps more dandism at Chesney Wold than the brilliant and distinguished circle will find good for itself in the long run, for it is even with the stillest and politest circles as with the circle the necromancer draws around him, very strange appearances may be seen in active motion outside, with this difference that being realities and not phantasms, there's the greater danger of their breaking, and Chesney Wold is quite full, anyhow so full that a burning sense of injury arises in the breasts of ill-lodged ladies' maids, and is not to be extinguished. Only one room is empty. It is a turret chamber of the third order of merit, plainly, but comfortably furnished, and having an old-fashioned business air. It is Mr. Tulkinghorn's room, and is never bestowed on anybody else, for he may come at any time. He has not come yet. It is his quiet habit to walk across the park from the village in fine weather to drop into this room as if he had never been out of it since he was last seen there, to request a servant to inform Celeste that he has arrived in case he should be wanted, and to appear 10 minutes before dinner. In the shadow of the library door he sleeps in his turret with a complaining flagstaff over his head, and has some ledges outside on which any fine morning, when he is down here, his black figure may be seen walking before breakfast like a larger species of rook. Every day before dinner my lady looks for him in the dusk of the library, but he is not there every day at dinner. My lady glances down the table for the vacant place that would be waiting to receive him if he had just arrived, but there is no vacant place. Every night my lady casually asks her maid, "Is Mr. Tulkinghorn come?" Every night the answer is no, my lady. Not yet one night, while having her hair undressed, my lady loses herself in deep thought after this reply, until she sees her own brooding face in the opposite glass, and a pair of black eyes curiously observing her. "Be so good as to attend," says my lady, then addressing the reflection of Hortense, "to your business. You can contemplate your beauty at another time." "Pardo, it was your ladyship's beauty that," says my lady, "you needn't contemplate at all." At length, one afternoon a little before sunset, when the bright groups of figures, which have for the last hour, or to enliven the ghost's walk, are all dispersed, and only Sir Leicester and my lady remain upon the terrace, Mr. Tulkinghorn appears. He comes towards them at his usual methodical pace, which is never quick and never slackened. He wears his usual expressionless mask, if it be a mask, and carries family secrets in every limb of his body and every crease of his dress, whether his whole soul is devoted to the great or whether he yields them nothing beyond the services he sells is his personal secret. He keeps it as he keeps the secrets of his clients. He is his own client in that matter, and will never betray himself. "How do you do, Mr. Tulkinghorn?" says Celeste, giving him his hand. "Mr. Tulkinghorn is quite well, Sir Leicester is quite well, my lady is quite well, all highly satisfactory." The lawyer, with his hands behind him, walks at Celeste's side along the terrace. My lady walks upon the other side. "We expected you before," says Celeste, a gracious observation, as much as to say, "Mr. Tulkinghorn, we remember your existence when you are not here to remind us of it. By your presence, we bestow a fragment of our minds upon you, sir." "You see," Mr. Tulkinghorn, comprehending it, inclines his head and says he is much obliged. "I should have come down sooner," he explains, "and but that I have been much engaged with those matters in the several suits between yourself and Boythorn, a man of a very ill-regulated mind," observes Sir Leicester with severity, "an extremely dangerous person in any community, a man of a very low character of mind. He is obstinate," says Mr. Tulkinghorn. "It is natural to such a man to be so," says Celeste, looking most profoundly obstinate himself. "I am not at all surprised to hear it. The only question is," pursues the lawyer, "whether you will give up anything." "No, sir," replies Celeste, "nothing I give up. I don't mean anything of importance. That of course I know you would not Abandon, I mean any minor point, Mr. Tulkinghorn returns Sir Leicester. There can be no minor point between myself and Mr. Boythorn. If I go farther and observe that I cannot readily conceive how any right of mine can be a minor point, I speak not so much in reference to myself as an individual as in reference to the family position. I have it in charge to maintain. Mr. Tulkinghorn inclines his head again. I have now my instructions. He says Mr. Boythorn will give us a good deal of trouble. Is the character of such a mind, Mr. Tulkinghorn. Celeste interrupts him. To give trouble an exceedingly ill-conditioned leveling person, a person who 50 years ago would probably have been tried at the Old Bailey for some demagogic proceeding and severely punished, if not, adds Celeste after a moment's pause, if not hanged, drawn, and quartered. Celeste appears to discharge his stately breast of a burden in passing this capital sentence, as if it were the next satisfactory thing to having the sentence executed. But night is coming on, says he, and my lady will take cold. My dear, let us go in. As they turn towards the hall door, Lady Dedlock addresses Mr. Tulkinghorn for the first time. You sent me a message respecting the person whose writing I happened to inquire about. It was like you to remember the circumstance. I had quite forgotten it. Your message reminded me of it again. I can't imagine what association I had with a hand like that, but I surely had some. You had some, Mr. Tulkinghorn repeats. Yes, returns my lady carelessly. I think I must have had some. And did you really take the trouble to find out the writer of that actual thing? What is it? Affidavit? Yes. How very odd. They pass into a somber breakfast room on the ground floor, lighted in the bay by two deep windows. It is now twilight. The fire glows brightly on the paneled wall and palely on the window glass, where through the cold reflection of the blaze, the colder landscape shudders in. The wind and a gray mist creeps along the only traveler. Besides the waste of clouds, my lady lounges in a great chair in the chimney corner, and Celeste takes another great chair opposite. The lawyer stands before the fire with his hand out at arm's length, shading his face. He looks across his arm at my lady. Yes, he says, I inquired about the man and found him, and what is very strange, I've found him not to be any out-of-the-way person. I'm afraid Lady Dedlock languidly anticipates. I found him dead. Oh dear me, remonstrated Celeste, not so much shocked by the fact as by the fact of the fact being mentioned. I was directed to his lodging, a miserable poverty-stricken place, and I found him dead. You will excuse me, Mr. Tulkinghorn observed Celeste. I think the less said. Pray, Celeste, let me hear the story out. It is my lady speaking. It is quite a story for twilight. A very shocking dead. Mr. Tulkinghorn reasserts it by another inclination of his head, whether by his own hand. Upon my honor, cried Sir Leicester, really do let me hear the story. Says my lady, whatever you desire, my dear. But I must say no, you mustn't say. Go on, Mr. Tulkinghorn. Celeste's gallantry concedes the point, though he still feels that to bring this sort of squalor among the upper classes is really. I was about to say, resumes the lawyer with undisturbed calmness, that whether he had died by his own hand or not, it was beyond my power to tell you. I should have meant that phrase, however, by saying that he had unquestionably died of his own act, though whether by his own deliberate intention or by mischance can never certainly be known. The coroner's jury found that he took the poison accidentally. And what kind of man, my lady asks, was this deplorable creature? Very difficult to say, returns the lawyer, shaking his head. He had lived so wretchedly and was so neglected with his gypsy color and his wild black hair and beard that I should have considered him the commonest of the common. The surgeon had a notion that he had once been something better, both in appearance and condition. What did they call the wretched being? They called him what he had called himself, but no one knew his name, not even anyone who had attended on him. No one had attended on him. He was found dead. In fact, I found him without any clue to anything more, without any. There was, says the lawyer meditatively, an old portmanteau. But no, there were no papers. During the utterance of every word of this short dialogue, Lady Dedlock and Mr. Tulkinghorn, without any other alteration in their customary deportment, have looked very steadily at one another, as was natural perhaps in the discussion of so unusual a subject. Celeste has looked at the fire with the general expression of the Dedlock on the staircase. The story being told, he renews his stately protest, saying that, as it is quite clear that no association in my lady's mind can possibly be traceable to this poor Wretch, unless he was a begging letter writer, he trusts to hear no more about a subject so far removed from my lady's station, certainly a collection of horrors, says my lady, gathering up her mantles and furs. But they interest one for the moment. Have the kindness, Mr. Tulkinghorn, to open the door for me. Mr. Tulkinghorn does so with deference, and hold it open while she passes out. She passes close to him. With her usual fatigued manner and insolent grace, they meet again at dinner again. Next day again, for many days in succession, Lady Dedlock is always the same exhausted deity, surrounded by worshippers and terribly liable to be bored to death even while presiding at her own shrine. Mr. Tulkinghorn is always the same speechless repository of noble confidences, so oddly out of place and yet so perfectly at home. They appear to take as little note of one another as any two people enclosed within the same walls could. But whether each ever more watches and suspects the other, ever more mistrustful of some great reservation, whether each is ever more prepared at all points for the other, and never to be taken unawares, what each would give to know how much the other knows, all this is hidden for the time in their own hearts. Chapter 30. Nestor's narrative. We held many consultations about what Richard was to be first without Mr. Johns, as he had requested, and afterwards with him. But it was a long time before we seemed to make progress. Richard said he was ready for anything when Mr. John Dice doubted whether he might not already be too old to enter the Navy. Richard said he had thought of that, and perhaps he was. When Mr. John Dyson asked him what he thought of the Army, Richard said he had thought of that too, and it wasn't a bad idea. When Mr. Jardice advised him to try and decide within himself whether his old preference for the sea was an ordinary boyish inclination or a strong impulse, Richard answered, well, he really had tried very often, and he couldn't make out how much of this indecision of character, Mr. Janday said to me, is chargeable on that incomprehensible heap of uncertainty and procrastination on which he has been thrown from his birth. I don't pretend to say, but the Chancery, among its other sins, is responsible for some of it. I can plainly see it has engendered or confirmed in him a habit of putting off and trusting to this, that, and the other chance, without knowing what chance, and dismissing everything as unsettled, uncertain, and confused. The character of much older and steadier people may be even changed by the circumstances surrounding them. It would be too much to expect that a boy's in its formation should be the subject of such influences and escape them. I felt this to be true, though if I may venture to mention what I thought besides, I thought it much to be regretted that Richard's education had not counteracted those influences or directed his character. He had been 8 years at a public school and had learnt, I understood, to make Latin verses of several sorts in the most admirable manner. But I never heard that it had been anybody's business to find out what his natural bent was, or where his failings lay, or to adapt any kind of knowledge to him. He had been adapted to the verses, and had learnt the art of making them to such perfection, that if he had remained at school until he was of age, I suppose he could only have gone on making them over and over again, unless he had enlarged his education by forgetting how to do it still. Although I had no doubt that they were very beautiful and very improving and very sufficient for a great many purposes of life, and always remembered all through life, I did doubt whether Richard would not have profited by someone studying him a little, instead of his studying them quite so much. To be sure, I knew nothing of the subject, and do not even now know whether the young gentlemen of classic Rome or Greece made verses to the same extent, or whether the young gentlemen of any country ever did. I haven't the least idea, said Richard, musing, what I had better be, except that I'm quite sure I don't want to go into the church. It's a toss-up. You have no inclination in Mr. Kenji's way, suggested Mr. John Dyson. I don't know that, sir, replied Richard. I am fond of boating. Article clerks go a good deal on the water. It's a capital profession. Surgeon, suggested Mr. Jandas. That's the thing, sir, cried Richard the first. Doubt if he had ever once thought of it before. That's the thing, sir, repeated Richard with the greatest enthusiasm. We have got it at last, MRCS. He was not to be laughed out of it, though he laughed at it heartily. He said he had chosen his profession, and the more he thought of it, the more he felt that his destiny was clear. The art of healing was the art of all others for him, mistrusting that he only came to this conclusion because, having never had much chance of finding out for himself what he was fitted for, and having never been guided to the discovery, he was taken by the newest idea and was glad to get rid of the trouble of consideration. I wondered whether the Latin verses often ended in this or whether Richard's was a solitary case. Mr. Jarndyce took great pains to talk with him seriously and to put it to his good sense not to deceive himself in so important a matter. Richard was a little grave after these interviews, but invariably told Ada and me that it was all right, and then began to talk about something else. By heaven, cried Mr. Boythorn, who interested himself strongly in the subject, though I need not say that, for he could do nothing weakly. I rejoiced to find a young gentleman of spirit and gallantry, devoting himself to that noble profession. The more spirit there is in it, the better for mankind, and the worse for those mercenary taskmasters and low tricksters who delighted putting that illustrious art at a disadvantage in the world by all that is base and despicable, cried Mr. Boythorn. The treatment of surgeons aboard ship is such that I would submit the legs, both legs of every member of the Admiralty Board, to a compound fracture and render it a transportable offense in any qualified practitioner to set them if the system were not wholly changed in 48 hours. Wouldn't you give them a week? asked Mr. Jarndyce. No, cried Mr. Boythorn firmly, not on any consideration. 48 hours. As to corporations, parishes, vestries, boards, and similar gatherings of jolt-headed clods who assemble to exchange such speeches, that by heaven they ought to be worked in quicksilver mines for the short remainder of their miserable existence, if it were only to prevent their detestable English from contaminating a language spoken in the presence of the sun. As to those fellows who meanly take advantage of the ardor of gentlemen in the pursuit of knowledge to recompense the inestimable services of the best years of their lives, their long study, and their expensive education, with pittances too small for the acceptance of clerks, would have the necks of every one of them wrung, and their skulls arranged in Surgeons' Hall for the contemplation of the whole profession, in order that its younger members might understand from actual measurement in early life how thick skulls may become. He wound up this vehement declaration by looking round upon us with a most agreeable smile, and suddenly thundering ha 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 over and over again, until anybody else might have been expected to be quite subdued by the exertion, as Richard still continued to say that he was fixed in his choice after repeated periods for consideration had been recommended by Mr. Jarndyce and had expired, and he still continued to assure Ada and me in the same final manner that it was all right. It became advisable to take Mr. Kenge into counsel. Mr. Kenge therefore came down to dinner one day and leaned back in his chair and turned his eyeglasses over and over and spoke in a sonorous voice, and did exactly what I remember to have seen him do when I was a little girl. Said Mr. Kenge, yes, well, a very good profession, Mr. Jarndyce, a very good profession. The course of study and preparation requires to be diligently pursued, observed my guardian with a glance at Richard. Oh, no doubt, said Mr. Kenge diligently, but that being the case more or less with all pursuits that are worth much, said Mr. Jarndyce, it is not a special consideration which another choice would be likely to escape. Truly, said Mr. Kenge, and Mr. Richard Carstone, who has so meritoriously acquitted himself in the, shall I say, the classic shades in which his youth had been passed, will no doubt apply the habits, if not the principles and practice of versification in that tongue in which a poet was said, unless I mistake, to be born, not made, to the more eminently practical field of action on which he enters. You may rely upon it, said Richard in his offhand manner, that I shall go at it and do my best. Very well, Mr. Jarndyce, said Mr. Kenge, gently nodding his head. Really, when we are assured by Mr. Richard that he means to go at it and to do his best, nodding feelingly and smoothly over those expressions, I would submit to you that we have only to inquire into the best mode of carrying out the object of his ambition. Now, with reference to placing Mr. Richard with some sufficiently eminent practitioner, is there anyone in view at present? No one, Rick, I think, said my guardian. No one, sir, said Richard. Quite so, observed Mr. Kenge. As to situation now, is there any particular feeling on that head? No, said Richard. Quite so, observed Mr. Kenge. Again, I should like a little variety, said Richard. I mean a good range of experience. Very requisite, no doubt, returned Mr. Kent. I think this may be easily arranged, Mr. Jarndyce. We have only, in the first place, to discover a sufficiently eligible practitioner, and as soon as we make our want, and shall I add our ability to pay a premium known, our only difficulty will be in the selection of one from a large number. We have only, in the second place, to observe those little formalities which are rendered necessary by our time of life, and our being under the guardianship of the court, we shall soon be, shall I say, in Mr. Richard's own light-hearted manner, going at it to our heart's content. It is a coincidence, said Mr. Kenge with a tinge of melancholy in his smile, one of those coincidences which may or may not require an explanation beyond our present limited faculties, that I have a cousin in the medical profession. He might be deemed eligible by you and might be disposed to respond to this proposal. I can answer for him as little as for you, but he might, as this was an opening in the prospect. It was arranged that Mr. Ken should see his cousin, and as Mr. Jardice had before proposed to take us to London for a few weeks, it was settled next day that we should make our visit at once and combine Richard's business with it. Mr. Boythorn leaving us within a week, we took up our abode at a cheerful lodging near Oxford Street over an upholsterer's shop. London was a great wonder to us, and we were out for hours and hours at a time seeing the sights, which appeared to be less capable of exhaustion than we were. We made the round of the principal theaters to with great delight and saw all the plays that were worth seeing. I mention this because it was at the theater that I began to be made uncomfortable again by Mr. Guppy. I was sitting in front of the box one night with Ada, and Richard was in the place he liked best, behind Ada's chair, when, happening to look down into the pit, I saw Mr. Guppy with his hair flattened down upon his head and woe depicted in his face, looking up at me. I felt all through the performance that he never looked at the actors but constantly looked at me, and always with a carefully prepared expression of the deepest misery and the profoundest dejection. It quite spoiled my pleasure for that night, because it was so very embarrassing and so very ridiculous. But from that time forth we never went to the play without my seeing Mr. Guppy in the pit, always with his hair straight and flat, his shirt collar turned down, and a general feebleness about him if he were not there when we went in. And I began to hope he would not come, and yielded myself for a little while to the interest of the scene. I was certain to encounter his languishing eyes when I least expected it, and from that time to be quite sure that they were fixed upon me all the evening. I really cannot express how uneasy this made me. If he would only have brushed up his hair or turned up his collar, it would have been bad enough, but to know that that absurd figure was always gazing at me, and always in that demonstrative state of despondency, put such a constraint upon me that I did not like to laugh at the play, or to cry at it, or to move, or to speak. I seemed able to do nothing naturally. As to escaping Mr. Guppy by going to the back of the box, I could not bear to do that, because I knew Richard and Ada relied on having me next them, and that they could never have talked together so happily if anybody else had been in my place. So there I sat, not knowing where to look, for wherever I looked I knew Mr. Guppy's eyes were following me, and thinking of the dreadful expense to which this young man was putting himself on my account, sometimes I thought of telling Mr. John Dice. Then I feared that the young man would lose his situation, and that I might ruin him. Sometimes I thought of confiding in Richard, but was deterred by the possibility of his fighting Mr. Guppy and giving him black eyes. Sometimes I thought, should I frown at him or shake my head? Then I felt I could not do it. Sometimes I considered whether I should write to his mother, but that ended in my being convinced that to open a correspondence would be to make the matter worse. I always came to the conclusion finally that I could do nothing. Mr. Guppy's perseverance all this time not only produced him regularly at any theater to which we went, but caused him to appear in the crowd as we were coming out, and even to get up behind our fly, where I am sure I saw him 2 or 3 times struggling among the most dreadful spikes. After we got home, he haunted a post opposite our house. The armpost is where we lodged, being at the corner of 2 streets, and my bedroom window being opposite the post. I was afraid to go near the window when I went upstairs, lest I should see him as I did one moonlit night, leaning against the post and evidently catching cold. If Mr. Guppy had not been, fortunately for me, engaged in the daytime, I really should have had no rest from him while we were making this round of gaieties in which Mr. Guppy so extraordinarily participated. The business which had helped to bring us to town was not neglected. Mr. Kenge's cousin was a Mr. Byme Badger, who had a good practice at Chelsea and attended a large public institution. Besides, he was quite willing to receive Richard into his house and to superintend his studies, and as it seemed that Those could be pursued advantageously under Mr. Badger's roof, and Mr. Badger liked Richard, and as Richard said he liked Mr. Badger well enough, an agreement was made, the Lord Chancellor's consent was obtained, and it was all settled on the day when matters were concluded between Richard and Mr. Badger. We were all under engagement to dine at Mr. Badger's house. We were to be merely a family party, Mrs. Badger's note said, and we found no lady there, but Mrs. Badger herself. She was surrounded in the drawing room by various objects indicative of her painting, a little playing the piano, a little playing the guitar, a little playing the harp, a little singing, a little working, a little reading, a little writing poetry, a little and bottling, a little. She was a lady of about 50, I should think, youthfully dressed, and of a very fine complexion. If I add to the little list of her accomplishments that she rouged a little, I do not mean that there was any harm in it. Mr. Bam Badger himself was a pink, fresh-faced, crisp-looking gentleman with a weak voice, white teeth, light hair, and surprised eyes. Some years younger, I should say, than Mrs. Bam Badger. He admired her exceedingly, but principally, and to begin with, on the curious ground, as it seemed to us, of her having had 3 husbands. We had barely taken our seats when he said to Mr. Jardice, quite triumphantly, "You would hardly suppose that I am Mrs. Bam Badger's third." "Indeed," said Mr. Jardice. "A third," said Mr. Badger. "Mrs. Bam Badger has not the appearance, Miss Somerset, of a lady who has had 2 former husbands," I said. "Not at all, and most remarkable men," said Mr. Badger, in a tone of confidence. "Captain Swauser of the Royal Navy, who was Mrs. Badger's first husband, was a very distinguished officer. Indeed, the name of Professor Dingo, my immediate predecessor, is one of European reputation." Mrs. Badger overheard him and smiled. "Yes, my dear Mr. Badger," replied to the smile, "I was observing to Mr. John Dyson, Miss Summerson, that you had 2 former husbands, both very distinguished men, and they found it, as people generally do, difficult to believe. I was barely 20, said Mrs. Badger, when I married Captain Swallows of the Royal Navy. I was in the Mediterranean with him. I am quite a sailor. On the 12th anniversary of my wedding day, I became the wife of Professor Dingo, of European reputation," added Mr. Badger in an undertone. "And when Mr. Badger and myself were married," pursued Mrs. Badger, "we were married on the same day of the year. I had become attached to the day so that Mrs. Badger has been married to 3 husbands, 2 of them highly distinguished men," said Mr. Badger, summing up the facts, "and each time upon March 21st at 11 in the forenoon, we all expressed our admiration. But for Mr. Badger's modesty," said Mr. Jardice, "I would take leave to correct him and say 3 distinguished men." "Thank you, Mr. Jardice. What I always tell him," observed Mrs. Badger. "And my dear," said Mr. Badger, "what do I always tell you? That without any affectation of disparaging such professional distinction as I may have attained, which our friend Mr. Carstone will have many opportunities of estimating, I am not so weak, no, really," said Mr. Badger, "to us generally so unreasonable as to put my reputation on the same footing with such first-rate men as Captain Swartz and Professor Dingo. Perhaps you may be interested." Mr. John Dees, continued Mr. Bam Badger, leading the way into the next drawing room, "in this portrait of Captain Switzer. It was taken on his return home from the African station, where he had suffered from the fever of the country. Mrs. Badger considers it too yellow, but it's a very fine head, a very fine head." We all echoed, "A very fine head, I feel when I look at it," said Mr. Badger. "That's a man I should like to have seen. It strikingly bespeaks the first-class man. That Captain Swassa preeminently was on the other side. Professor Dingo, I knew him well, attended him in his last illness. A speaking likeness over the piano, Mrs. Bam Badger, when Mrs. Swassa over the sofa, Mrs. Bam Badger, when Mrs. Dingo of Mrs. Bam Badger, in a say I possess the original and have no copy." Dinner was now announced, and we went downstairs. It was a very genteel entertainment, very handsomely served, but the captain and the professor still ran in Mr. Badger's head, and as Ada and I had the honor of being under his particular care, we had the full benefit of them. "Water, Miss Summerson, allow me, and not in that tumbler. Pray bring me the professor's goblet." James. Ada very much admired some artificial flowers under a glass. "Astonishing how they keep," said Mr. Badger. "They were presented to Mrs. Bam Badger when she was in the Mediterranean." He invited Mr. John Dice to take a glass of claret. "Not that claret," he said. "Excuse me, this is an occasion, and on an occasion I produce some very special claret. I happen to have James Captain Swas's wine." Mr. John Dees. "This is a wine that was imported by the Captain, we will not say how many years ago. You will find it very curious, my dear. I shall be happy to take some of this wine with you. Captain Swartz's claret to your mistress. James, my love, your health. After dinner, when we ladies retired, we took Mrs. Badger's first and second husband with us. Mrs. Badger gave us in the drawing room a biographical sketch of the life and services of Captain Swassa before his marriage, and a more minute account of him dating from the time when he fell in love with her at a ball on board the Crippler given to the officers of that ship when she lay in Plymouth Harbor. The dear old Crippler, said Mrs. Badger, shaking her head. She was a noble vessel, trim shipshape all a tanto, as Captain Swassa used to say. You must excuse me if I occasionally introduce a nautical expression. I was quite a sailor once. Captain Swartz loved that craft for my sake. When she was no longer in commission, he frequently said that if he were rich enough to buy her old hulk, he would have an inscription let into the timbers of the quarterdeck where we stood as partners in the dance to mark the spot where he fell raked for. And aft, Captain Swallows used to say, by the fire from my tops. It was his naval way of mentioning my eyes. Mrs. Badger shook her head, sighed, and looked in the glass. It was a great change from Captain Swauser to Professor Dingo, she resumed with a plaintive smile. I felt it a good deal at first, such an entire revolution in my mode of life, but custom combined with science, particularly science, inured me to it. Being the professor's sole companion in his botanical excursions, I almost forgot that I'd ever been afloat, and became quite learned. It is singular that the professor was the antipodes of Captain Swassa, and that Mr. Badger is not in the least like either. We then passed into a narrative of the deaths of Captain Swassa and Professor Dingo, both of whom seem to have had very bad complaints in the course of it. Mrs. Badger signified to us that she had never madly loved but once, and that the object of that wild affection, never to be recalled in its fresh enthusiasm, was Captain Swassa. The professor was yet dying by inches in the most dismal manner, and Mrs. Badger was giving us imitations of his way of saying, with great difficulty, "Where's Lavra? Let Lavra give me my toast and water," when the entrance of the gentleman consigned him to the tomb. Now I observed that evening, as I had observed for some days past, that Ada and Richard were more than ever attached to each other's society, which was but natural, seeing that they were going to be separated so soon. I was therefore not very much surprised when we got home and I retired upstairs to find Ada more silent than usual, though I was not quite prepared for her coming into my arms and beginning to speak to me, with her face hidden. "My darling Esther," murmured Ada, "I have a great secret to tell you, a mighty secret, my pretty one." "No doubt. What is it, Ada?" "Oh, Esther, you would never guess." "Shall I try to guess?" said I. "Oh no, don't, pray don't," cried Ada, very much startled by the idea of my doing so. "Now I wonder who it can be about," said I, pretending to consider. "It's about," said Ada in a whisper, "it's about my cousin Richard." "Well, my own," said I, kissing her bright hair, which was all I could see. "And what about him?" "Oh, Esther, you would never guess." It was so pretty to have her clinging to me in that way, hiding her face, and to know that she was not crying in sorrow, but in a little glow of joy and pride, and hope that I would not help her just yet. "He says, I know it's very foolish, we are both so young, but he says with a burst of tears that he loves me dearly." "Esther, does he indeed?" said I. "I never heard of such a thing. Why, my pet of pets, I could have told you that weeks and weeks ago." To see Ada lift up her flushed face in joyful surprise, and hold me round the neck, and laugh and cry and blush was so pleasant. "Why, my darling," said I, "what a goose you must take me for. Your cousin Richard has been loving you as plainly as he could for I don't know how long, and yet you never said a word about it," cried Ada, kissing me. "No, my love," said I waited to be told, but now I have told you. You don't think it wrong of me, do you?" returned Ada. She might have coaxed me to say no if I had been the hardest-hearted duenna in the world. Not being that yet, I said no very freely. "And now," said I know the worst of it." "Oh, that's not quite the worst of it, Esther dear," cried Ada, holding me tighter and laying down her face again upon my breast. "No," said I, "not even that." "No, not even that," said Ada, shaking her head. "Why, you never mean to say—" I was beginning and joke, but Ada, looking up and smiling through her tears, cried, "Yes, I do, you know I do," and then sobbed out, "With all my heart I do, with all my whole heart." "Esther," I told her, laughing, why I had known that to just as well as I had known the other. And we sat before the fire, and I had all the talking to myself for a little while, though there was not much of it, and Ada was soon quiet, and happy do you think my cousin John knows, dear Dame Durden?" she asked. "Unless my cousin John is blind, my pet," said I should think my cousin John knows pretty well as much as we know. "We want to speak to him before Richard goes," said Ada timidly, "and we wanted you to advise us and to tell him. So perhaps you wouldn't mind Richard's coming in, Dame Durden." "Oh, Richard is outside, is he, my dear?" said I am not quite certain," returned Ada with a bashful simplicity that would have won my heart if she had not won it long before. "But I think he's waiting at the door there. He was, of course." They brought a chair on either side of me and put me between them, and really seemed to have fallen in love with me. Instead of one another, they were so confiding and so trustful and so fond of me. They went on in their own wild way for a little while. I never stopped them. I enjoyed it too much myself. And then we gradually fell to considering how young they were, and how there must be a lapse of several years before this early love could come to anything, and how it could come to happiness only if it were real and lasting, and inspired them with a steady resolution to do their duty to each other with constancy, fortitude, and perseverance, each always for the other's sake. Well, Richard said that he would work his fingers to the bone for Ada, and Ada said that she would work her fingers to the bone for Richard, and they called me all sorts of endearing and sensible names. And we sat there advising and talking half the night. Finally, before we parted, I gave them my promise to speak to their cousin John tomorrow. So when tomorrow came, I went to my guardian after breakfast in the room that was our town substitute for the growlery, and told him that I had it in trust to tell him something. "Well, little woman," said he, shutting up his book, "if you have accepted the trust, there can be no harm in it." "I hope not, guardian," said I can guarantee that there is no secrecy in it, for it only happened yesterday." "And what is it, Esther?" guardian, said I. "You remember the happy night when first we came down to Bleak House, when Ada was singing in the dark room?" I wished to call to his remembrance the look he had given me then. "Unless I am much mistaken, I saw that I did so, because," said I with a little hesitation. "Yes, my dear," said he. "Don't hurry, because," said I, "Ada and Richard have fallen in love, and have told each other so already," cried my guardian, quite astonished. "Yes," said I, "and to tell you the truth, guardian, I rather expected it." "The deuce you did," said he. He sat considering for a minute or two, with his smile at once so handsome and so kind upon his changing face, and then requested me to let them know that he wished to see them when they came. He encircled Ada with one arm in his fatherly way, and addressed himself to Richard with a cheerful gravity. "Rick," said Mr. Jardice, "I am glad to have won your confidence. I hope to preserve it when I contemplated these relations between us, for which have so brightened my life, and so invested it with new interests and pleasures. I certainly did contemplate afar off the possibility of you and your pretty cousin here. Don't be shy, Ada, don't be shy, my dear, being in a mind to go through life together. I saw, and do see, many reasons to make it desirable. But that was a far off, Rick, afar off. We look afar off, sir," returned Richard. "Well," said Mr. Jardice, "that's rational. Now hear me, my dears. I might tell you that you don't know your own minds yet, that 1,000 things may happen to divert you from one another, that it is well this chain of flowers you have taken up is very easily broken, or it might become a chain of lead. But I will not do that. Such wisdom will come soon enough, I dare say. If it is to come at all, I will assume that a few years hence you will be in your hearts to one another what you are today. All I say before speaking to you according to that assumption is, if you do change, if you do come to find that you are more commonplace cousins to each other as man and woman than you were as boy and girl, your manhood will excuse me. Rick, don't be ashamed still to confide in me, for there will be nothing monstrous or uncommon in it. I am only your friend and distant kinsman. I have no power over you whatever, but I wish and hope to retain your confidence. If I do nothing to forfeit it, I am very sure, sir," returned Richard, "that I speak for Ada too when I say that you have the strongest power over us both, rooted in respect, gratitude, and affection, strengthening every day." "Dear cousin John," said Ada on his shoulder, "my father's place can never be empty again. All the love and duty I could ever have rendered to him is transferred to you." "Come," said Mr. Jardice, "now for our assumption. Now we lift our eyes up and look hopefully at the distance. Rick, the world is before you, and it is most probable that as you enter it, so it will receive you. Trust in nothing but in Providence, and your own efforts. Never separate the two like the heathen wagoner. Constancy in love is a good thing, But it means nothing, and is nothing without constancy in every kind of effort. If you had the abilities of all the great men past and present, you could do nothing well without sincerely meaning it and setting about it. If you entertain the supposition that any real success in great things or in small ever was, or could be, ever will, or can be wrested from fortune by fits, and starts leave that wrong idea here, or leave your cousin Ada here. I will leave it here, sir, replied Richard, smiling. If I brought it here just now, but I hope I did not, and will work my way on to my cousin Ada in the hopeful distance. Right, said Mr. Jarndyce. If you are not to make her happy, why should you pursue her? I wouldn't make her unhappy, no, not even for her love, retorted Richard proudly. Well said, cried Mr. Jarndyce. That's well said. She remains here in her home with me. Love her, Rick, in your active life, no less than in her home when you revisit it, and all will go well. Otherwise, all will go ill. That's the end of my preaching. I think you and Ada had better take a walk. Ada tenderly embraced him, and Richard heartily shook hands with him. And then the cousins went out of the room, looking back again directly, though, to say that they would wait for me. The door stood open, and we both followed them with our eyes as they passed down the adjoining room, on which the sun was shining, and out at its farther end Richard, with his head bent and her hand drawn through his arm, was talking to her very earnestly, and she looked up in his face listening, and seemed to see nothing else. So young, so beautiful, so full of hope and promise, they went on lightly through the sunlight, as their own happy thoughts might be. Then traversing the years to come, and making them all years of brightness, till they passed away into the shadow and were gone. It was only a burst of light that had been so radiant the room darkened as they went out, and the sun was clouded over. Am I right, Esther? Said my guardian. When they were gone, he was so good and wise to ask me whether he was right. Rick may gain out of this the quality he wants at the core of so much that is good, said Mr. Jarndyce, shaking his head. I have said nothing to Ada, Esther. She is her friend and counselor, always near. And he laid his hand lovingly upon my head. I could not help showing that I was a little moved, though I did all I could to conceal it. Tut, tut, said he. But we must take care, too, that our little woman's life is not all consumed in care for others' care. My dear guardian, I believe I am the happiest creature in the world. I believe so, too, said he. But someone may find out what Esther never will, that the little woman is to be held in remembrance above all other people. I have omitted to mention in its place that there was someone else at the family dinner party. It was not a lady, it was a gentleman. It was a gentleman of a dark complexion, a young surgeon. He was rather reserved, but I thought him very sensible and agreeable. At least Ada asked me if I did not, and I said yes. Chapter 14. Departure. Richard left us on the very next evening to begin his new career, and committed Ada to my charge with great love for her and great trust in me. It touched me then to reflect, and it touches me now more nearly to remember having what I have to tell, how they both thought of me even at that engrossing time. I was a part of all their plans for the present and the future. I was to write Richard once a week, making my faithful report of Ada, who was to write to him every alternate day. I was to be informed under his own hand of all of his labors and successes. I was to observe how resolute and persevering he would be. I was to be Ada's bridesmaid when they were married. I was to live with them afterwards. I was to keep all the keys of their house. I was to be made happy forever and a day. And if the suit should make us rich, Esther, which it may, you know, said Richard, to crown all. A shade crossed Ada's face. My dearest Ada, asked Richard, why not? It had better declare us poor at once, said Ada. I don't know about that, returned Richard, but at all events it won't declare anything at once. It hasn't declared anything in heaven knows how many years. To true, said Ada. Yes, but, urged Richard, answering what her look suggested rather than her words, the longer it goes on, dear cousin, the nearer it must be to a settlement one way or other. Now, is that not reasonable? You know best, Richard, but I am afraid if we trust to it, it will make us unhappy. But my Adar, we are not going to trust to it, cried Richard gaily. We know it better than to trust to it. We only say that if it should make us rich, we have no constitutional objection to being rich. The court is by solemn settlement of law our grim old guardian, and we are to suppose that what it gives us, when it gives us anything, is our right. It is not necessary to quarrel with our right. No, said Ada, but it may be better to forget all about it. Well, well, cried Richard, then we will forget all about it. We can sign the whole thing to oblivion." Dame Durden puts on her approving face. "And it's done." Dame Durden's approving face, said I, looking out of the box in which I was packing his books, was not very visible when you called it by that name. "But it does approve, and she thinks she can't do better." So Richard said there was an end of it, and immediately began on no other foundation to build as many castles in the air as would man the Great Wall of China. He went away in high spirits. Ada and I, prepared to miss him very much, commenced our quieter career. On our arrival in London, we had called with Mr. Jandis at Mrs. Jellyby's, but had not been so fortunate as to find her at home. It appeared that she had gone somewhere to a tea drinking, and had taken Miss Jellyby with her. Besides the tea drinking, there was to be some considerable speech making and letter writing on the general merits of the cultivation of coffee, conjointly with natives at the settlement of Burrow Bulick. All this involved no doubt sufficient active exercise of pen and ink to make her daughter's part in the proceedings anything but a holiday, it being now beyond the time appointed for Mrs. Jellyby's return. We called again. She was in town, but not at home, having gone to Mile End directly after breakfast on some Boreal Bullen business arising out of a society called the East London Branchade Ramification, as I had not seen Peepy on the occasion of our last call, when he was not to be found anywhere, and when the cook rather thought he must have strolled away with a dustman's cart. I now inquired for him again. The oyster shells he had been building a house with were still in the passage, but he was nowhere discoverable, and the cook supposed that he had gone off to the sheep. When we repeated with some surprise the sheep, she said, "Oh yes, on market days he sometimes followed them quite out of town, and came back in such a state as never was." I was sitting at the window with my guardian on the following morning, and Ada was busy writing, of course, to Richard, when Miss Jellyby was announced and entered leading the identical Peepy, whom she had made some endeavors to render presentable by wiping the dirt into corners of his face and hands and making his hair very wet, and then violently frizzling it with her fingers. Everything the dear child wore was either too large for him or too small. Among his other contradictory decorations, he had the hat of a bishop and the little gloves of a baby. His boots were on a small scale the boots of a plowman, while his legs so crossed and recrossed with scratches that they looked like maps were bare below. A very short pair of plaid drawers, finished off with 2 frills of perfectly different patterns. The deficient buttons on his plaid frock had evidently been supplied from one of Mr. Jellyby's coats. They were so extremely brazen and so much too large. Most extraordinary specimens of needlework appeared on several parts of his dress where it had been hastily mended, and I recognized the same hand on Miss Jellyby's. She was, however, unaccountably improved in her appearance, and looked very pretty. She was conscious of poor little Peepy being but a failure after all her trouble, and she showed it as she came in by the way in which she glanced first at him and then at us. "Oh dear me," said my guardian, "do East Ada," and I gave her a cordial welcome and presented her to Mr. Jardice, to whom she said as she sat down, "Mars compliments, and she hopes you'll excuse her, because she's correcting proofs of the plan. She's going to put out 5,000 new circulars, and she knows you'll be interested to hear that I have brought one of them with me. Mars compliments," with which she presented it sulkily enough. "Thank you," said my guardian. "I am much obliged to Mrs. Jellyby. Oh dear me, this is a very trying wind." We were busy with Peepy taking off his clerical hat, asking him if he remembered us, and so on. Peepy retired behind his elbow at first, but relented at the sight of sponge cake and allowed me to take him on my lap, where he sat munching quietly. Mr. Jandis then withdrawing into the temporary growlery, Miss Jellyby opened a conversation with her usual abruptness. "We are going on just as bad as ever in Thavies," and said she, "I have no peace of my life. Talk of Africa, I couldn't be worse off if I was a what's-his-name man and a brother." I tried to say something soothing. "Oh, it's of no use, Miss Summerson," exclaimed Miss Jellyby, "though I thank you for the kind intention. All the same, I know how I am used, and I am not to be talked over. You wouldn't be talked over if you were used, so Peepy, go and play at wild beast under the piano." "I shan't," said Peepy. "Very well, you ungrateful, naughty, hard-hearted boy," returned Miss Jellyby with tears in her eyes. "I'll never take pains to dress you any more." "Yes, I will go, Caddy," cried Peepy, who was really a good child, and who was so moved by his sister's vexation that he went at once. "It seems a little thing to cry about," said poor Miss Jellyby apologetically, but I am quite worn out. I was directing the new circulars till to this morning. I detest the whole thing so that alone makes my head ache, till I can't see out of my eyes and look at that poor unfortunate child. Was there ever such a fright as he is pee-pee happily unconscious of the defect in his appearance, sat on the carpet behind one of the legs of the piano, looking calmly out of his den at us while he ate his cake. I've sent him to the other end of the room, observed Miss Jellaby, drawing her chair nearer ours, because I don't want him to hear the conversation. Those little things are so sharp. I was going to say we really are going on worse than ever. PA will be a bankrupt before long, and then I hope Ma will be satisfied. There'll be nobody but Ma to thank for it. We said we hoped Mr. Jelly's affairs were not in so bad a state as that it's of no use hoping, though. It's very kind of you, returned Miss Jelly, shaking her head. Pa told me only yesterday morning, and dreadfully unhappy he is that he couldn't weather the storm. I should be surprised if he could, when all our tradesmen send into our house any stuff they like, and the servants do what they like with it. And I have no time to improve things if I knew how, and Ma don't care about anything. I should like to make out how Pa is to weather the storm. I declare, if I was Pa I'd run away, my dear, said I, smiling. Your papa no doubt considers his family. Oh yes, his family is all very fine, Miss Summerson, replied Miss Jellaby, but what comfort is his family to him? His family is nothing but bills, dirt, waste, noise, tumbles downstairs, confusion and wretchedness. His scrambling home from week's end to week's end is like one great washing day, only nothing's washed. Miss Jellaby tapped her foot upon the floor and wiped her eyes. I am sure I pity part of that degree, she said, and I'm so angry with Ma that I can't find words to express myself. However, I'm not going to bear it. I am determined. I won't be a slave all my life, and I won't submit to be proposed by Mr. Quayle. A pretty thing indeed to marry a philanthropist. As if I hadn't had enough of that, said poor Miss Jellaby. I must confess that I could not help feeling rather angry with Mrs. Jellaby myself, seeing and hearing this neglected girl, and knowing how much of bitterly satirical truth there was in what she said. If it wasn't that we had been intimate when you stopped at our house, pursued Miss Jellaby, I should have been ashamed to come here today, for I know what a figure I must seem to you two. But as it is, I made up my mind to call, especially as I'm not likely to see you again the next time you come to town. She said this with such great significance that Ada and I glanced at one another, foreseeing something more. No, said Miss Jellaby, shaking her head. Not at all likely. I know I may trust you two. I'm sure you won't betray me. I am engaged without their knowledge at home, said I. Why, good gracious me, Miss Summerson, she returned, justifying herself in a fretful but not angry manner. How can it be otherwise? You know what Mar is, and I needn't make poor Pa more miserable by telling him. But would it not be adding to his unhappiness to marry without his knowledge or consent, my dear? Said I. No, said Miss Jellaby, softening. I hope not. I should try to make him happy and comfortable when he came to see me, and PP and the others should take it in turns to come and stay with me, and they should have some care taken of them. Then there was a good deal of affection, and poor Caddy, she softened more and more while saying this, and cried so much over the unwanted little home picture she had raised in her mind. But Peepee in his cave under the piano was touched and turned himself over on his back with loud lamentations. It was not until I had brought him to kiss his sister and had restored him to his place on my lap and had shown him that Caddy was laughing, she laughed expressly for the purpose that we could recall his peace of mind. Even then it was for some time conditional on his taking us in turns by the chin and smoothing our faces all over with his hand. At last, as his spirits were not equal to the piano, we put him on a chair to look out of window, and Miss Jellaby, holding him by one hand, resumed her confidence. It began in your coming to our house, she said. We naturally asked how I felt. I was so awkward, she replied, that I made up my mind to be improved in that respect, at all events, and to learn to dance. I told Ma I was ashamed of myself, and I must be taught to dance. Ma looked at me in that provoking way of hers as if I wasn't in sight, but I was quite determined to be taught to dance, and so I went to Mr. Turveydrop's Academy in Newman Street. And was it there, my dear? I began. Yes, it was there, said Caddy, and I'm engaged to Mr. Turveydrop. There are two Mr. Turveydrops, father and son. My Mr. Turveydrop is the son, of course. I only wish I had been better brought up and was likely to make him a better wife, for I am very fond of him. I am sorry to hear this, said I must confess I don't know why you should be sorry, she retorted a little anxiously. But I am engaged to Mr. Turvey Drop whether or no, and he is very fond of me. It's a secret as yet even on his side, because old Mr. Turvey Drop has a share in the connection, and it might break his heart or give him some other shock if he was told of it abruptly. Old Mr. Turvey Drop is a very gentlemanly man, indeed very gentlemanly. Does his wife know of it, asked Ada. Old Mr. Turvey Drop's wife, Miss Claire, returned Miss Jellaby, opening her eyes. There's no such person. He is a widower. We were here, interrupted by Peepee, whose leg had undergone so much on account of his sister's unconsciously jerking it like a bell rope whenever she was emphatic, that the afflicted child now bemoaned his sufferings with a very low-spirited noise as he appealed to me for compassion, and as I was only a listener, I undertook to hold him. Miss Jellaby proceeded, after begging Peepee's pardon with a kiss and assuring him that she hadn't meant to do it. That's the state of the case, said Caddy. If I ever blame myself, I still think it's Mars' fault. We are to be married whenever we can, and then I shall go to Par at the office and write to Mar. It won't agitate Mar. I'm only pen and ink to her. One great comfort is, said Caddy with a sob, that I shall never hear of Africa after I am married. Young Mr. Turveydrop hates it for my sake, and if old Mr. Turveydrop knows there is such a place, it's as much as he does. It was he who was very gentlemanly, I think, said I. Very gentlemanly indeed, said Caddy. He is celebrated almost everywhere for his deportment. Does he teach, asked Ada. No, he don't teach anything in particular, replied Caddy, but his deportment is beautiful. Caddy went on to say with considerable hesitation and reluctance that there was one thing more she wished us to know and felt we ought to know, and which she hoped would not offend us. It was that she had improved her acquaintance with Miss Flight, the little crazy old lady, and that she frequently went there early in the morning and met her lover for a few minutes before breakfast. Only for a few minutes. I go there at other times, said Caddy, but Prince does not come. Then young Mr. Turveydrop's name is Prince. I wish it wasn't, because it sounds like a dog, but of course he didn't christen himself. Old Mr. Turveydrop had him christened Prince in remembrance of the Prince Regent. Old Mr. Turveydrop adored the Prince Regent on account of his deportment. I hope you won't think the worse of me for having made these little appointments, Miss Flights, where I first went with you, because I liked the poor thing for her own sake, and I believe she likes me. If you could see young Mr. Turveydrop, I am sure you would think well of him. At least I am sure you couldn't possibly think any ill of him. I am going there now for my lesson. I couldn't ask you to go with me, Miss Summerson, but if you would, said Caddy, who had said all this earnestly and tremblingly, I should be very glad. It happened that we had arranged with my guardian to go to Miss Flight's that day. We had told him of our former visit, and our account had interested him, but something had always happened to prevent our going there again, as I trusted that I might have sufficient influence with Miss Jellaby to prevent her taking any very rash step if I fully accepted the confidence she was so willing to place in me. Poor girl, I proposed that she and I and Peepee should go to the academy, and afterwards meet my guardian and Adora at Miss Flight's, whose name I now learnt for the first time. This was on condition that Miss Jellaby and Peepee should come back with us to dinner, the last article of the agreement being joyfully agreed to by both. We smartened Peepee up a little with the assistance of a few pins, some soap and water, and a hairbrush, and went out bending our steps towards Newman Street, which was very near. I found the academy established in a sufficiently dingy house at the corner of an archway, with busts in all the staircase windows in the same house. There were also established, as I gathered from the plates on the door, a drawing master, a coal merchant. There was certainly no room for his coals, and a lithographic artist on the plate, which in size and situation took precedence of all the rest. I read Mr. Turveydrop. The door was open, and the hall was blocked up by a grand piano, a harp, and several other musical instruments in cases, all in progress of removal, and all looking rakish in the daylight. Miss Jellaby informed me that the academy had been lent last night for a concert. We went upstairs. It had been quite a fine house once, when it was anybody's business to keep it clean and fresh, and nobody's business to smoke in it all day. And into Mr. Turveydrop's great room, which was built out into a mews at the back and was lighted by a skylight. It was a bare, resounding room, smelling of stables, with cane forms along the walls and the walls ornamented at regular intervals with painted lyres and little cut glass. Branches for candles, which seemed to be shedding their old-fashioned drops as other branches might shed autumn leaves. Several young lady pupils ranging from 13 or 14 years of age to 2 or 3 and 20 were assembled, and I was looking among them for their instructor when Caddy, pinching my arm, repeated the ceremony of introduction. Miss Summerson, Mr. Prince Turvey Drop. I curted to a little blue-eyed fireman of youthful appearance, with flaxen hair parted in the middle, and curling at the ends all round his head. He had a little fiddle, which we used to call at school a kit, under his left arm, and its little bow in the same hand. His little dancing shoes were particularly diminutive, and he had a little innocent, feminine manner which not only appealed to me in an amiable way, but made this singular effect upon me. But I received the impression that he was like his mother, and that his mother had not been much considered or well used. "I'm very happy to see Miss Jellyby's friend," he said, bowing low to me. I began to fear with timid tenderness, as it was past the usual time, that Miss Jellyby was not coming. "I beg you will have the goodness to attribute that to me who have detained her, and to receive my excuses, sir," said I. "Oh dear," said he, "and pray I entreat it, do not allow me to be the cause of any more delay." With that apology I withdrew to a seat between Peepee, who being well used to it had already climbed into a corner place, and an old lady of a censorious countenance whose two nieces were in the class, and who was very indignant with Peepee's boots. Prince Turvey Drop then tinkled the strings of his kit with his fingers, and the young lady stood up to dance. Just then there appeared from a side door old Mr. Turvey Drop in the full luster of his deportment. He was a fat old gentleman with a false complexion, false teeth, false whiskers, and a wig. He had a fur collar, and he had a padded breast to his coat which only wanted a star or a broad blue ribbon to be complete. He was pinched in and swelled out and got up and strapped down as much as he could possibly bear. He had such a neckcloth on, puffing his very eyes out of their natural shape, and his chin, and even his ears, so sunk into it that it seemed as though he must inevitably double up if it were cast loose. He had under his arm a hat of great size and weight, shelving downward from the crown to the brim, and in his hand a pair of white gloves, with which he flapped it as he stood poised on one leg in a high-shouldered, round-elbowed state of elegance, not to be surpassed. He had a cane, he had an eyeglass, he had a snuff box, he had rings, he had wristbands, he had everything but any touch of nature. He was not like youth, he was not like age, he was not like anything in the world, but a model of deportment. "Father, a visitor, Miss Jellyby's friend, Miss Summerson." "Distinguished," said Mr. Turvey Drop, by Miss Summerson's presence, as he bowed to me. In that tight state I almost believe I saw creases come into the whites of his eyes. "My father," said the son aside to me, with quite an affecting belief in him, "is a celebrated character. My father is greatly admired." "Go on, Prince, go on," said Mr. Turvey Drop, standing with his back to the fire and waving his gloves condescendingly. "Go on, my son." At this command, or by this gracious permission, the lesson went on. Prince Turvey Drop sometimes played the kit dancing, sometimes played the piano standing, sometimes hummed the tune with what little breath he could spare, while he set a pupil right, always conscientiously moved with the least proficient through every step and every part of the figure, and never rested for an instant. His distinguished father did nothing whatever but stand before the fire, a model of deportment. "And he never does anything else," said the old lady of the censorious countenance. "Yet would you believe that it's his name on the doorplate? His son's name is the same, you know," said I. "He wouldn't let his son have any name if he could take it from him," returned the old lady. "Look at the son's dress. It certainly was plain, threadbare, almost shabby. Yet the father must be garnished and tricked out," said the old lady. "Because of his deportment I'd deport him, transport him would be better." I felt curious to know more concerning this person. I asked, "Does he give lessons in deportment?" Now, returned the old lady shortly. "Never did." After a moment's consideration, I suggested that perhaps fencing had been his accomplishment. "I don't believe he can fence at all, ma'am," said the old lady. I looked surprised and inquisitive, the old lady becoming more and more incensed against the master of deportment as she dwelt upon the subject, gave me some particulars of his career, with strong assurances that they were mildly stated. He had married a meek little dancing mistress with a tolerable connection, having never in his life before done anything but to deport himself and had worked her to death, or had at the best suffered her to work herself to death to maintain him in those expenses, which were indispensable to his position, at once to exhibit his deportment to the best models, and to keep the best models constantly before himself. He had found it necessary to frequent all public places of fashionable and lounging resort, to be seen at Brighton and elsewhere at fashionable times, and to lead an idle life in the very best clothes to enable him to do this. The affectionate little dancing mistress had toiled and labored, and would have toiled and labored to that hour if her strength had lasted so long, for the mainspring of the story was that, in spite of the man's absorbing selfishness, his wife, overpowered by his deportment, had to the last believed in him, and had on her death-bed in the most moving terms confided him to their son as one who had an inextinguishable claim upon him, and whom he could never regard with too much pride and deference. The son, inheriting his mother's belief, and having the deportment always before him, had lived and grown in the same faith, and now at 30 years of age worked for his father 12 hours a day, and looked up to him with veneration on the old imaginary pinnacle. The airs the fellow gives himself, said my informant, shaking her head at old Mr. Turvey drop with speechless indignation, as he drew on his tight gloves, of course unconscious of the homage she was rendering. He fully believes he is one of the aristocracy, and he is so condescending to the son, he so egregiously deludes, that you might suppose him the most virtuous of parents, said the old lady, apostrophizing him with infinite vehemence. I could bite you, I could not help being amused, though I heard the old lady out with feelings of real concern. It was difficult to doubt her with the father and son before me. What I might have thought of them without the old lady's account, or what I might have thought of the old lady's account without them, I cannot say. There was a fitness of things in the whole that carried conviction with it. My eyes were yet wandering from young Mr. Turvey drop working so hard to old Mr. Turvey drop deporting himself so beautifully. When the latter came ambling up to me and entered into conversation, he asked me first of all whether I conferred a charm and a distinction on London by residing in it. I did not think it necessary to reply that I was perfectly aware I should not do that in any case, but merely told him where I did reside. A lady so graceful and accomplished, he said, kissing his right glove, and afterwards extending it towards the pupils. We look leniently on the deficiencies. Here we do our best to polish. He sat down beside me, taking some pains to sit on the form, I thought, in imitation of the print of his illustrious model on the sofa, and really he did look very like it. To polish, polish, he repeated, taking a pinch of snuff and gently fluttering his fingers. But we are not, if I may say so, to one form to be graceful both by nature and art, with a high-shouldered bow, which it seemed impossible for him to make without lifting up his eyebrows and shutting his eyes. We are not what we used to be in point of deportment. Are we not, sir? Said I. We have degenerated, he returned, shaking his head, which he could do to a very limited extent in his cravat. A leveling age is not favorable to deportment. It develops vulgarity. Perhaps I speak with some little partiality. It may not be for me to say that I have been called for some years now Gentleman Turvey drop, or that His Royal Highness the Prince Regent did me the honor to inquire on my removing my hat, as he drove out of the pavilion at Brighton, that fine building. Who is he? Who the devil is he? Why don't I know him? Why hasn't he 30,000 a year? But these are little matters of anecdote. The general property, ma'am, still repeated occasionally among the upper classes. Indeed, said I. He replied with a high-shouldered bow. Where what is left among us of deportment, he added, still lingers. England, alas, my country has degenerated very much, and is degenerating every day. She has not many gentlemen left. We are few. I see nothing to succeed us but a race of weavers. One might hope that the race of gentlemen would be perpetuated here. Said I. You are very good. He smiled with a high-shouldered bow again. You flatter me. But no, I have never been able to imbue my poor boy with that part of his art. Heaven forbid that I should disparage my dear child. But he has no deportment. He appears to be an excellent master, I observed. Understand me, my dear madam. He is an excellent master. All that can be acquired, he has acquired. All that can be imparted, he can impart. But there are things. He took another pinch of snuff and made the bow again, as if to add this kind of thing. For instance, I glanced towards the center of the room, where Miss Jellyby's lover, now engaged with single pupils, was undergoing greater drudgery than ever. My amiable child, murmured Mr. Terry Drop, adjusting his cravat. Your son is indefatigable, said I. It is my reward, said Mr. Trevay Drop, to hear you say so. In some respects he treads in the footsteps of his sainted mother. She was a devoted creature. But woman, lovely woman, said Mr. Trevay Drop, with very disagreeable gallantry. What a sex you are. I rose and joined Miss Jellaby, who was by this time putting on her bonnet. The time allotted to a lesson having fully elapsed, there was a general putting on of bonnets when Miss Jellaby and the unfortunate prince found an opportunity to become betrothed. I don't know, but they certainly found none on this occasion to exchange a dozen words. My dear, said Mr. Trevay Drop benignly to his son, do you know the hour? No, father. The son had no watch. The father had a handsome gold one, which he pulled out with an air that was an example to mankind. My son, said he, it is 2 o'clock. Recollect your school at Kensington at 3. That's time enough for me, father, said Prince. I can take a morsel of dinner standing and be off. My dear boy, returned his father, you must be very quick. You will find the cold mutton on the table. Thank you, father. Are you off now, father? Yes, my dear, I suppose, said Mr. Trevay Drop, shutting his eyes and lifting up his shoulders with modest consciousness. And I must show myself as usual about time. You had better dine out comfortably somewhere, said his son. My dear child, I intend to. I shall take my little meal, I think, at the French house in the Opera Colonnade. That's right. Goodbye, father, said Prince, shaking hands. Goodbye, my son. Bless you. Mr. Trevay Drop said this in quite a pious manner, and it seemed to do his son good, who in parting from him was so pleased with him, so dutiful to him, and so proud of him, that I almost felt as if it were an unkindness to the younger man not to be able to believe implicitly in the elder. The few moments that were occupied by Prince in taking leave of us, and particularly of one of us, as I saw being in the secret, enhanced my favorable impression of his almost childish character. I felt a liking for him and a compassion for him as he put his little kid in his pocket, and with it his desire to stay a little while with Caddy, and went away good-humoredly to his cold mutton and his school at Kensington, that made me scarcely less irate with his father than the censorious old lady. The father opened the room door for us and bowed us out in a manner I must acknowledge worthy of his shining original. In the same style, he presently passed us on the other side of the street on his way to the aristocratic part of the town, where he was going to show himself among the few other gentlemen left. For some moments, I was so lost in reconsidering what I had heard and seen in Newman Street that I was quite unable to talk to Caddy, or even to fix my attention on what she said to me, especially when I began to inquire in my mind whether there were or ever had been any other gentlemen not in the dancing profession who lived and founded a reputation entirely on their deportment. This became so bewildering and suggested the possibility of so many Mr. Trevay Drops that I said, Esther, you must make up your mind to abandon this subject altogether and attend to Caddy. I accordingly did so, and we chatted all the rest of the way to Lincoln's Inn. Caddy told me that her lover's education had been so neglected that it was not always easy to read his notes. She said if he were not so anxious about his spelling and took less pains to make it clear, he would do better, but he put so many unnecessary letters into short words that they sometimes quite lost their English appearance. He does it with the best intention, observed Caddy, but it hasn't the effect he means. Poor fellow. Caddy then went on to reason. How could he be expected to be a scholar when he had passed his whole life in the dancing school and had done nothing but teach and fag and teach morning, noon, and night? And what did it matter? She could write letters enough for both, as she knew, to her cost, and it was far better for him to be amiable than learn it. Besides, it's not as if I was an accomplished girl who had any right to give herself airs, said Caddy. I know little enough, I'm sure, thanks to Ma. There's another thing I want to tell you now we are alone, continued Caddy, which I should not have liked to mention unless you had seen Prince. Miss Summerson, you know what a house ours is. It's of no use my trying to learn anything that it would be useful for Prince's wife to know. In our house we live in such a state of muddle that it's impossible, and I have only been more disheartened whenever I have tried, so I get a little practice with, who do you think, poor Miss Flight. Early in the morning I help her to tidy her room and clean her birds, and I make her a cup of coffee for her. Of course she taught me, and I have learned to make it so well that Prince says it's the very best coffee he ever tasted, and would quite delight old Mr. Trevay Drop, who is very particular indeed about his coffee. I can make little puddings too, and I know how to buy neck of mutton and tea and sugar and butter, and a good many housekeeping things. I am not clever at my needle yet, said Caddy, glancing at the repairs on Peepy's frock, but perhaps I shall improve, and since I have been engaged to Prince, and have been doing all this, I have felt better tempered, I hope, and more forgiving to Ma. It rather put me out at first this morning to see you and Miss Claire looking so neat and pretty, and to feel ashamed of Peepy, and myself too. But on the whole, I hope I am better tempered than I was, and more forgiving to Ma, the poor girl trying so hard, said it from her heart, and touched mine. Caddy, my love, I replied, I begin to have a great affection for you, and I hope we shall become friends. Oh, do you? Cried Caddy. How happy that would make me, my dear. Caddy said, I let us be friends from this time, and let us often have a chat about these matters, and try to find the right way through them. Caddy was overjoyed. I said everything I could in my old-fashioned way to comfort and encourage her, and I would not have objected to old Mr. Gervais drop that day for any smaller consideration than a settlement on his daughter-in-law. By this time, we were come to Mr. Crook's, whose private door stood open. There was a bill pasted on the doorpost announcing a room to let on the second floor. It reminded Kathy to tell me as we proceeded upstairs that there had been a sudden death there and an inquest, and that our little friend had been ill of the fright. The door and window of the vacant room being open, we looked in. It was the room with the dark door to which Miss Flight had secretly directed my attention when I was last in the house. A sad and desolate place. It was a gloomy, sorrowful place that gave me a strange sensation of mournfulness and even dread. You look pale, said Caddy. When we came out in cold, I felt as if the room had chilled me. We had walked slowly while we were talking, and my guardian and Ada were here before us. We found them in Miss Flight's garret. They were looking at the birds while a medical gentleman, who was so good as to attend Miss Flight with much solicitude and compassion, spoke with her cheerfully by the fire. I have finished my professional visit, he said, coming forward. Miss Flight is much better, and may appear in court as her mind is set upon it tomorrow. She has been greatly missed there, I understand. Miss Flight received the compliment with complacency, and dropped a general curtsy to us. Honored indeed, said she, by another visit from the wards in Jandas. Very happy to receive John Dice of Bleak House beneath my humble roof. With a special curtsy. Fitz John Dice, my dear. She had bestowed that name on Caddy, it appeared, and always called her by it. A double welcome. Has she been very ill? asked Mr. Jardice of the gentleman whom we had found in attendance on her. She answered for herself directly, though he had put the question in a whisper. Oh, decidedly unwell. Oh, very unwell indeed, she said confidentially. Not pain, you know, trouble, not bodily so much as nervous. The truth is, in a subdued voice and trembling, we have had death here. There was poison in the house. I am very susceptible to such horrid things. It frightened me. Only Mr. Woodcourt knows how much. My physician, Mr. Woodcourt, with great stateliness. The wards in John Dale's Jandas of Bleak House. Fitz Jandas, Miss Flight said Mr. Woodcourt in a grave kind of voice, as if he were appealing to her while speaking to us, and laying his hand gently on her arm. Miss Flight describes her illness with her usual accuracy. She was alarmed by an occurrence in the house which might have alarmed a stronger person, and was made ill by the distress and agitation. She brought me here in the first hurry of the discovery. Though too late for me to be of any use to the unfortunate man, I have compensated myself for that disappointment by coming here since, and being of some small use to her. The kindest physician in the college, whispered Miss Flight to me. I expect a judgment on the day of judgment, and shall then confer his states. She will be as well in a day or two, said Mr. Woodcourt, looking at her with an observant smile, as she ever will be. In other words, quite well, of course. Have you heard of her good fortune? Most extraordinary, said Miss Flight, smiling brightly. You never heard of such a thing, my dear? Every Saturday conversation Kenge or Guppy the clerk to conversation. K places in my hand a paper of shillings. I assure you, always the same number in the paper, always one for every day in the week. Now you know really so well timed, is it not? Yes. From whence do these papers come, you say? That is the great question. Naturally. Shall I tell you what I think? I think, said Miss Flight, drawing herself back with a very shrewd look, and shaking her right forefinger in a most significant manner, that the Lord Chancellor, aware of the length of time during which the Great Seal has been open, or it has been open a long time forwards them, until the judgment I expect is given now. That's very creditable, you know, to confess in that way, that he is a little slow for human life, so delicate. Attending court the other day, I attended regularly with my documents. I taxed him with it, and he almost confessed that as I smiled at him from my bench, and he smiled at me from his bench. But it's great good fortune, is it not? And Fitzjandis lays the money out for me to great advantage. Oh, I assure you, to the greatest advantage. I congratulated her as she addressed herself to me upon this fortunate addition to her income, and wished her a long continuance of it. I did not speculate upon the source from which it came, or wonder whose humanity was so considerate. My guardian stood before me contemplating the birds, and I had no need to look beyond him. And what do you call these little fellows, ma'am? Said he in his pleasant voice. Have they any names? I can answer for Miss Flight that they have, said I, for she promised to tell us what they were. Ada remembers. Ada remembered very well. Did I? Said Miss Flight. Who's that? At my door. What? Were you listening at my door for Crook? The old man of the house, pushing it open before him, appeared there with a fur cap in his hand, and his cat at his heels. I oughtn't listening, Miss Flight. He said I was going to give a rap with my knuckles only. You're so quick. Make your cat go down. Drive her away. The old lady angrily exclaimed. Baba, there ain't no danger, gentlefolks, said Mr. Crook, looking slowly and sharply from one to another until he had looked at all of us. She'd never offer at the birds when I was here unless I told her to. It. You'll excuse my landlord, said the old lady with a dignified air. Quite am. What do you want, Crook, when I have company? Oi, said the old man. You know I am the Chancellor. Well, returned Miss Flight. What of that? For the Chancellor, said the old man with a chuckle, not to be equated with a jaundice, is queer, ain't it, Miss Flight? Mightn't I take the liberty? Your servant, sir. I know John Doss, and John Doss almost as well as you do, sir. I knowed old Squire Toms. I never to my knowledge see you afore, though not even in court, yet I do go there a mortal sight of times in the course of the year, taking one day with another. I never go there, said Mr. Jardice, which he never did on any consideration. I would sooner go somewhere else. Would you, though? Returned Crook, grinning. You're bearing hard upon my noble and learned brother in your meaning, sir. No, perhaps it is but natural in a John Dice the burnt child, sir. What, you're looking at my lodger's birds? Mr. John Dice, the old man, had come by little and little into the room, until he now touched my guardian with his elbow and looked close up into his face with his spectacled eyes. It's one of her strange ways that she never tell the names of these birds, if she can help it, though she named them. All this was in a whisper. Shall I run over Freud? He asked aloud, winking at us and pointing at her as she turned away, affecting to sweep the grate. If you like, she answered hurriedly. The old man, looking up at the cages, after another look at us, went through the list. Hope, joy, youth, peace, rest, life, dust, ashes, waste, want, ruin, despair, madness, death, cunning, folly, words, wigs, rags, sheepskin, plunder, precedent, jargon, gammon, and spinach. That's the whole collection, said the old man, all cooped up together by my noble and learned brother. This is a bitter wind, muttered my guardian, when my noble and learned brother gives his judgment. They're to be let go free, said Crook, winking at us again. And then he added, whispering and grinning, if that ever was to happen, which it won't, the birds that have never been caged would kill him if ever the wind was in the east, said my guardian, pretending to look out of the window for a weathercock. I think it's there today. We found it very difficult to get away from the house. It was not Miss Light who detained us. She was as reasonable a little creature in consulting the convenience of others as there possibly could be. It was Mr. Crook. He seemed unable to detach himself from Mr. Jardice. If he had been linked to him, he could hardly have attended him more closely. He proposed to show us his court of chancery and all the strange medley it contained. During the whole of our inspection, prolonged by himself, he kept close to Mr. John Dice, and sometimes detained him under one pretense or other until we had passed on, as if he were tormented by an inclination to enter upon some secret subject which he could not make up his mind to approach. I cannot imagine a countenance and manner more singularly expressive of caution and indecision, and a perpetual impulse to do something he could not resolve to venture on, than Mr. Crook's was that day. His watchfulness of my guardian was incessant. He rarely removed his eyes from his face. If he went on beside him, he observed him with the slyness of an old white fox. If he went before he looked back, when we stood still he got opposite to him and drawing his hand across his open mouth, with a curious expression of a sense of power, and turning up his eyes and lowering his gray eyebrows, until they appeared to be shut, seemed to skin every lineament of his face. At last, having been always attended by the cat all over the house, and having seen the whole stock of miscellaneous lumber, which was certainly curious, we came into the back part of the shop. Here on the head of an empty barrel stood on end were an ink bottle, some old stumps of pens, and some dirty playbills, and against the wall were pasted several large printed alphabets in several plain hands. "What are you doing here?" asked my guardian, trying to learn myself to read and write. Said Crook. "And how do you get on?" "Slow bad," returned the old man impatiently. "It's hard at my time of life. It would be easier to be taught by someone," said my guardian. "But they might teach me wrong," returned the old man with a wonderfully suspicious flash of his eye. "I don't know what I may have lost by not being learned afore. I wouldn't like to lose anything by being learned wrong now." "Wrong," said my guardian with his good-humored smile. "Who do you suppose would teach you wrong?" "I don't know, Mr. John Dice of Bleak House," replied the old man, turning up his spectacles on his forehead and rubbing his hands. "I don't suppose as anybody would, but I'd rather trust my own self than another." These answers and his manner were strange enough to cause my guardian to inquire of Mr. Woodcourt, as we all walked across Lincoln's Inn together, whether Mr. Crook were really, as his lodger represented him, deranged. The young surgeon replied, no, he had seen no reason to think so. He was exceedingly distrustful, as ignorance usually was, and he was always more or less under the influence of raw gin, of which he drank great quantities, and of which he and his back shop, as we might have observed, smelt strongly. But he did not think him mad as yet. On our way home I so conciliated Peepy's affections by buying him a windmill and a flour sacks, that he would suffer nobody else to take off his hat and gloves, and would sit nowhere at dinner, but at my side. Caddy sat upon the other side of me, next to Ada, to whom we imparted the whole history of the engagement. As soon as we got back we made much of Caddy and Peepy too, and Caddy brightened exceedingly, and my guardian was as merry as we were, and we were all very happy indeed, until Caddy went home at night in a hackney coach, with Peepy fast asleep, but holding tight to the windmill. I have forgotten to mention, at least I have not mentioned, that Mr. Woodcourt was the same dark young surgeon whom we had met at Mr. Badger's, or that Mr. John Dice invited him to dinner that day, or that he came, or that when they were all gone. And I said to Ada, "Now, my darling, let us have a little talk about Richard." Ada laughed and said, "But I don't think it matters what my darling said. She was always merry." Chapter 15. Bell Yard. While we were in London, Mr. Jardice was constantly beset by the crowd of excitable ladies and gentlemen whose proceedings had so much astonished us. Mr. Quayle, who presented himself soon after our arrival, was in all such excitements. He seemed to project those two shining knobs of temples of his into everything that went on, and to brush his hair farther and farther back, until the very roots were almost ready to fly out of his head. An irrepressible philanthropy. All objects were alike to him, but he was always particularly ready for anything in the way of a testimonial to anyone. His great power seemed to be his power of indiscriminate admiration. He would sit for any length of time, with the utmost enjoyment, bathing his temples in the light of any order of luminary. Having first seen him perfectly swallowed up in admiration of Mrs. Jellyby, I had supposed her to be the absorbing object of his devotion. I soon discovered my mistake, and found him to be train-bearer and organ-blower to a whole procession of people. Mrs. Particle came one day for a subscription to something, and with her Mr. Quayle. Whatever Mrs. Particle said, Mr. Quayle repeated to us, and just as he had drawn Mrs. Jellyby out, he drew Mrs. Particle out. Mrs. Particle wrote a letter of introduction to my guardian in behalf of her eloquent friend Mr. Gusher. With Mr. Gusher appeared Mr. Quayle again, Mr. Gusher being a flabby gentleman with a moist surface, and eyes so much too small for his moon of a face that they seemed to have been originally made for somebody else, was not at first sight prepossessing, yet he was scarcely seated before Mr. Quayle asked Adair, and me not inordinately, whether he was not a great creature, which he certainly was, flabbily speaking, though Mr. Quayle meant in intellectual beauty, and whether we were not struck by his massive configuration of brow. In short, we heard of a great many missions of various sorts among this set of people, But nothing respecting them was half so clear to us as that it was Mr. Quayle's mission to be in ecstasies with everybody else's mission, and that it was the most popular mission of all. Mr. Jardice had fallen into this company in the tenderness of his heart and his earnest desire to do all the good in his power, but that he felt it to be too often an unsatisfactory company where benevolence took spasmodic forms, where charity was assumed as a regular uniform by loud professors and speculators in cheap notoriety, vehement in profession, restless and vain in action, servile in the last degree of meanness to the great adulatory of one another, and intolerable to those who were anxious quietly to help the weak from failing, rather than with a great deal of bluster and self-laudation to raise them up a little way when they were down. He plainly told us when a testimonial was originated to Mr. Quayle by Mr. Gusher, who had already got one originated by Mr. Quayle, and when Mr. Gusher spoke for an hour and a half on the subject to a meeting including to charity schools of small boys and girls, who especially reminded of the widow's mite and requested to come forward with hampers and be acceptable sacrifices. I think the wind was in the east for 3 whole weeks. I mention this because I'm coming to Mr. Skimpole again. It seemed to me that his offhand professions of childishness and carelessness were a great relief to my guardian, by contrast with such things, and were the more readily believed in, since to find one perfectly undesigning and candid man among many opposites could not fail to give him pleasure. I should be sorry to imply that Mr. Skimpole divined this and was politic. I never really understood him well enough to know what he was to my guardian. He certainly was to the rest of the world. He had not been very well, and thus, though he lived in London, we had seen nothing of him until now. He appeared one morning in his usual agreeable way, and as full of pleasant spirits as ever. Well, he said here he had been bilious, but rich men were often bilious, and therefore he had been persuading himself that he was a man of property, so he was in a certain point of view in his expansive intentions. He had been enriching his medical attendant in the most lavish manner. He had always doubled and sometimes quadrupled his fees. He had said to the doctor, "Now, my dear doctor, it is quite a delusion on your part to suppose that you attend me for nothing. I am overwhelming you with money in my expansive intentions. If you only knew it." And really, he said he meant it to that degree that he thought it much the same as doing it if he had had those bits of metal or thin paper to which mankind attached so much importance to put in the doctor's hand. He would have put them in the doctor's hand, and not having them, he substituted the will for the deed very well if he really meant it, if his will were genuine and real, which it was. It appeared to him that it was the same as coin and cancel the obligation. It may be partly because I know nothing of the value of money, said Mr. Skimpole, but I often feel this. It seems so reasonable. My butcher says to me he wants that little bill. It's part of the pleasant unconscious poetry of the man's nature that he always calls it a little bill to make the payment appear easy. To both of us I replied to the butcher, "My good friend, if you knew it, you are paid. You haven't had the trouble of coming to ask for the little bill. You are paid, I mean it." "But suppose," said my guardian, laughing, he had meant the meat in the bill instead of providing it. "My dear Jardice," he returned, "you surprise me. You take the butcher's position." A butcher I once dealt with occupied that very ground. Says he, "Sir, why did you eat spring lamb at 18 pence a pound?" "Why did I eat spring lamb at 18 pence a pound?" my honest friend said. I, naturally amazed by the question. "I like spring lamb." This was so far convincing. "Well, sir," says he, "I wish I had meant the lamb as you mean the money." My good fellow, said I, "pray let us reason like intellectual beings. How could that be? It was impossible. You had got the lamb, and I have not got the money. You couldn't really mean the lamb without sending it in, whereas I can and do really mean the money without paying it." He had not a word. There was an end of the subject. "Did he take no legal proceedings?" inquired my guardian. "Yes, he took legal proceedings," said Mr. Skimpole, "but in that he was influenced by passion, not by reason." Passion reminds me of Boythorn. He writes me that you and the ladies have promised him a short visit at his bachelor house in Lincolnshire. "He is a great favorite with my girls," said Mr. Jardice, "and I have promised for them." Nature forgot to shade him off, I think, observed Mr. Skimpole, "to a dare, and me a little too boisterous, like the sea a little too vehement, like a bull who has made up his mind to consider every color scarlet. But I grant a sledge-hammering sort of merit in him. I should have been surprised if those two could have thought very highly of one another, Mr. Boythorn attaching so much importance to many things, and Mr. Skimpole caring so little for anything besides, which I have noticed Mr. Boythorn more than once on the point of breaking out into some strong opinion. When Mr. Skimp was referred to, of course I merely joined Ada in saying that we had been greatly pleased with him. He has invited me, said Mr. Skimpole, and if a child may trust himself in such hands, which the present child is encouraged to do with the united tenderness of two angels to guard him, I shall go. He proposes to frank me down and back again. I suppose it will cost money, shillings, perhaps, or pounds, or something of that sort. By the by, Coevans, you remember our friend Coevans, Miss Somerset? He asked me, as the subject arose in his mind in his graceful, light-hearted manner, and without the least embarrassment. Oh yes, said I. Coevances has been arrested by the great bailiff, said Mr. Skimp. He will never do violence to the sunshine anymore. It quite shocked me to hear that, for I had already recalled with anything but a serious association the image of the man sitting on the sofa that night wiping his head. His successor informed me of it yesterday, said Mr. Skimpole. His successor is in my house now, in possession, I think he calls it. He came yesterday on my blue-eyed daughter's birthday. I put it to him, this is unreasonable and inconvenient. If you had a blue-eyed daughter, you wouldn't like me to come uninvited on her birthday. But he stayed. Mr. Skimpole laughed at the pleasant absurdity and lightly touched the piano by which he was seated, and he told me, he said, playing little chords where I shall put full stops, the Coevances had left 3 children, no mother, and that Coevances' profession being unpopular, the rising Coevances were at a considerable disadvantage. Mr. John Dacey got up, rubbing his head, and began to walk about. Mr. Skimpole played the melody of one of Ada's favorite songs. Ada and I both looked at Mr. Jarndyce, thinking that we knew what was passing in his mind. After walking and stopping and several times leaving off rubbing his head and beginning again, my guardian put his hand upon the keys and stopped Mr. Skimpole's playing. I don't like this skimily, he said thoughtfully. Mr. Skimily, who had quite forgotten the subject, looked up surprised. The man was necessary, pursued my guardian, walking backward and forward in the very short space between the piano and the end of the room, and rubbing his hair up from the back of his head as if a high east wind had blown it into that form. If we make such men necessary by our faults and follies, or by our want of worldly knowledge, or by our misfortunes, we must not revenge ourselves upon them. There was no harm in his trade. He maintained his children. One would like to know more about this. Oh, Coevans, cried Mr. Skimpole at length, perceiving what he meant. Nothing easier a walk to Coevans headquarters, and you can know what you will. Mr. Jarndyce nodded to us, who were only waiting for the signal. Come, we will walk that way, my dears. Why not that way? As soon as another we were quickly ready and went out. Mr. Skimpole went with us and quite enjoyed the expedition. It was so new and so refreshing, he said, for him to want Coevanses instead of Coevanses wanting him. He took us first to Corset Street, Chancery Lane, where there was a house with barred windows which he called Coevan's Castle. On our going into the entry and ringing a bell, a very hideous boy came out of a sort of office and looked at us over a spiked wicket. Who did you want? said the boy, fitting 2 of the spikes into his chin. There was a follower or an officer or something here, said Mr. Jarndyce. Who is dead? Yeah, said the boy. Well, I want to know his name, if you please. Name of Neckett, said the boy. And his address? Bell Yard, said the boy. Chandler shop, left hand side. Name of Blinder? Was he? I don't know how to shape the question, murmured my guardian. Industrious was Neckett, said the boy. Yes, very much so. He was never tired of watching. He'd set up on a post at a street corner 8 or 10 hours at a stretch. If he undertook to do it, he might have done worse. I had my guardian's soliloquies. He might have undertaken to do it and not done it. Thank you, that's all I want. We left the boy with his head on one side and his arms on the gate, fondling and sucking the spikes, and went back to Lincoln's Inn, where Mr. Skimpole, who had not cared to remain nearer Coevanses, awaited us. Then we all went to Bell Yard, a narrow alley at a very short distance. We soon found the chandler's shop, and it was a good-natured looking old woman with a dropsy or an asthma, or perhaps both. Nick's children, said she in reply to my inquiry. Yes, surely, Miss Freepair, if you please. Door right opposite the stairs. And she handed me the key across the counter. I glanced at the key and glanced at her, but she took it for granted that I knew what to do with it, as it could only be intended for the children's door. I came out without asking any more questions and led the way up the dark stairs. We went as quietly as we could, but four of us made some noise on the aged boards, and when we came to the second story, we found we had disturbed a man who was standing there looking out of his room. "Is it Gridley that's wanted?" he asked, fixing his eyes on me with an angry stare. "No, sir," said I am going." Higher up he looked at Ada, and at Mr. John Dacey, and at Mr. Skimpole, fixing the same angry stare on each in succession as they passed and followed me. Mr. John Dacey gave him good day," he said abruptly and fiercely. He was a tall, sallow man with a careworn head on which but little hair remained, a deeply lined face and prominent eyes. He had a combative look and a chafing, irritable manner, which associated with his figure, still large and powerful though evidently in its decline, rather alarmed me. He had a pen in his hand, and in the glimpse I caught of his room in passing I saw that it was covered with a litter of papers. Leaving him standing there, we went up to the top room. I tapped at the door, and a little shrill voice inside said, "We're locked and Mrs. Blind has got the key." I applied the key on hearing this and opened the door. In a poor room with a sloping ceiling and containing very little furniture was a mite of a boy some 5 or 6 years old, nursing and hushing a heavy child of 18 months. There was no fire, though the weather was cold. Both children were wrapped in some poor shawls and tippets as a substitute. Their clothing was not so warm, however, but their noses looked red and pinched, and their small figures shrunken as the boy walked up and down, nursing and hushing the child with its head on his shoulder. "Who has locked you up here alone?" we naturally asked. "Charlie," said the boy, standing still to gaze at us. "Is Charlie your brother?" "No. She's my sister Charlotte. Father calls her Charlie." "Are there any more of you besides Charlie?" "Me," said the boy and Emma, patting the limp bonnet of the child he was nursing. "And Charlie, where's Charlie now?" "Out a washing," said the boy, beginning to walk up and down again and taking the Nankian bonnet much too near the bedstead by trying to gaze at us. At the same time, we were looking at one another and at these two children when there came into the room a very little girl, childish in figure, but shrewd and older looking in the face, pretty face, to wearing a womanly sort of bonnet much too large for her and drying her bare arms on a womanly sort of apron. Her fingers were white and wrinkled with washing, and the soap suds were yet smoking when she wiped off her arms. But for this she might have been a child playing at washing and imitating a poor working woman. With a quick observation of the truth, she had come running from some place in the neighborhood and had made all the haste she could. Consequently, though she was very light, she was out of breath and could not speak at first as she stood panting and wiping her arms and looking quietly at us. "Oh, here's Charlie," said the boy. The child he was nursing stretched forth its arms and cried out to be taken by Charlie. The little girl took it in a womanly sort of manner belonging to the apron and the bonnet and stood looking at us over the burden that clung to her most affectionately. "Is it possible," whispered my guardian as we put a chair for the little creature and got her to sit down with her load, the boy keeping close to her, holding to her apron, "that this child works for the rest? Look at this, for God's sake, look at this." It was a thing to look at the three children close together, and two of them relying solely on the third, and the third so young and yet with an air of age and steadiness that sat so strangely on the childish figure. "Charlie, Charlie," said my guardian. "How old are you?" "Over 13, sir," replied the child. "Oh, what a great age," said my guardian. "What a great age, Charlie." I cannot describe the tenderness with which he spoke to her, half playfully, yet all the more compassionately and mournfully. "And do you live alone here with these babies?" "Charlie," said my guardian. "Yes, sir," returned the child, looking up into his face with perfect confidence. "Since father died." "And how do you live?" "Charlie, oh Charlie," said my guardian, turning his face away for a moment. "How do you live since father died?" "Sir, I've gone out to work. I'm out washing today." "God help you, Charlie," said my guardian. "You're not tall enough to reach the tub in patterns." "I am, sir," she said quickly. "I've got a high pair, has belonged to mother." "And when did mother die?" "Poor mother, Mama died just after Emma was born," said the child, glancing at the face upon her bosom. "Then father said I was to be as good as a mother to her as I could, and so I tried, and so I worked at home and did cleaning and nursing and washing for a long time before I began to go out. And that's how I know how, don't you see, sir?" "And do you often go out?" "As often as I can," said Charlie, opening her eyes and smiling. "Because I earn in sixpences and shillings." "And do you always lock the babies up when you go out to Keep them safe, sir, don't you see, said Charlie. Mrs. Blinder comes up now and then, and Mr. Griggly comes up sometimes, and perhaps I can run and sometimes, and they can play, you know, and Tom ain't afraid of being locked up, are you, Tom? Now, said Tom stoutly. When it comes on dark, the lamps are lighted down in the court, and they show up here quite bright, almost quite bright, don't they, Tom? Yes, Charlie said. Tom, almost quite bright. Fanny's as good as gold, said the little creature, oh, in such a motherly, womanly way. And when Emma's tired, he puts her to bed, and when he's tired, he goes to bed himself. And when I come home and light the candle and has a bit of supper, he sits up again and has it with me, don't you, Tom? Oh, yes, Charlie, said Tom, that I do, and either in this glimpse of the great pleasure of his life, or in gratitude and love for Charlie, who was all in all to him, he laid his face among the scanty folds of her frock and passed from laughing into crying. It was the first time since our entry that a tear had been shed among these children. The little orphan girl had spoken of their father and mother as if all that sorrow was subdued by the necessity of taking courage and by her childish importance in being able to work, and by her bustling, busy way. But now when Tom cried, although she sat quite tranquil, looking quietly at us, and did not by any movement disturb a hair of the head of either of her little charges, I saw two silent tears fall down her face. I stood at the window with Ada pretending to look at the housetops and the blackened stack of chimneys and the poor plants and the birds in little cages belonging to the neighbors, when I found that Mrs. Blinder from the shop below had come in. Perhaps it had taken her all this time to get upstairs, and was talking to my guardian. It's not much to forgive him the rent, sir, she said. Who could take it from him? Well, well, said my guardian to us too. It is enough that the time will come when this good woman will find that it was much, and that for as much as she did it under the least of these. This child, he added after a few moments, could she possibly continue this? Really, sir, I think she might, said Mrs. Blinder, getting her heavy breath by painful degrees. She's as handy as it's possible to be. Oh, bless you, sir, the way she tended them to children after the mother died was the talk of the yard, and it was a wonder to see her with him after he was took ill. It really was Mrs. Blinder, he said to me the very last he spoke. He was lying there, Mrs. Blinder, whatever my calling may have been. I see an angel sitting in this room last night along with my child, and I trust her to our Father. He had no other calling, said my guardian. No, sir, returned Mrs. Blinder, he was nothing but a follower's. When he first came to lodge here, I didn't know what he was, and I confess that when I found out, I gave him notice. It wasn't light in the yard, it wasn't approved by the other lodgers. It is not a genteel calling, said Mrs. Blinder, and most people do object to it. Mr. Gridley objected to it very strong, and he is a good lodger, though his temper has been hard tried, so he gave him notice, said my guardian. So I gave him notice, said Mrs. Blinder. But really when the time came, and I knew no other ill of him, I was in doubts. He was punctual and diligent. He did what he had to do, sir, said Mrs. Blinder, unconsciously fixing Mr. Skimpole with her eye. And it's something in this world even to do that. So you kept him after all. Why, I said that if he could arrange with Mr. Gridley, I could arrange it with the other lodgers, and should not so much mind its being liked or disliked in the yard. Mr. Gridley gave his consent gruff, but he gave it. He was always gruff with him. But he has been kind to the children, since a person is never known till a person is proved. Have many people been kind to the children? Asked Mr. Jardice. Upon the whole, not so bad, sir, said Mrs. Blinder, but certainly not so many as would have been if their father's calling had been different. Mr. Co-Evans gave a guinea, and the followers made up a little purse. Some neighbors in the yard that had always joked and tapped their shoulders when he went by came forward with a little subscription, and in general not so bad. Similarly with Charlotte, some people won't employ her because she was a follower's child. Some people that do employ her cast it at her. Some make a merit of having her to work for them with that and all her drawbacks upon her, and perhaps pay her less and put upon her more. But she's patienter than others would be, and is clever too, and always willing up to the full mark of her strength, and over. So I should say in general not so bad, sir, but might be better. Mrs. Blinder sat down to give herself a more favorable opportunity of recovering her breath, exhausted anew by so much talking, before it was fully restored. Mr. Jardice was turning to speak to us when his attention was attracted by the abrupt entrance into the room of the Mr. Gridley who had been mentioned, and whom we had seen on our way up. I don't know what you may be doing here. Ladies and gentlemen, he said as if he resented our presence, but you'll excuse my coming in. I don't come in to stare about me. Well, Charlie, well, Tom, well, little one, how is it with us all today? He bent over the group in a caressing way and clearly was regarded as a friend by the children, though his face retained its stern character, and his manner to us was as rude as it could be. My guardian noticed it and respected it. No one surely would come here to stare about him, he said mildly. Maybe so, sir, maybe so, returned the other, taking Tom upon his knee and waving him off impatiently. I don't want to argue with ladies and gentlemen. I have had enough of arguing to last one man his life. You have sufficient reason, I dare say, said Mr. Jarndyce, for being chafed and irritated. There again, exclaimed the man, becoming violently angry. I am of a quarrelsome temper. I am irascible. I am not polite, not very, I think, sir, said Gridley, putting down the child and going up to him as if he meant to strike him. Do you know anything of courts of equity? Perhaps I do, to my sorrow, to your sorrow, said the man, pausing in his wrath. If so, I beg your pardon. I am not polite, I know. I beg your pardon, sir, with renewed violence. I have been dragged for 25 years over burning iron, and I have lost the habit of treading upon velvet. Go into the court of chancery yonder and ask what is one of the standing jokes that brighten up their business sometimes, and they will tell you that the best joke they have is the man from Shropshire. He said, beating one hand on the other passionately. I'm the man from Shropshire. I believe I and my family have also had the honor of furnishing some entertainment in the same grave place, said my guardian composedly. You may have heard my name, Jarndyce. Mr. Jarndyce, said Gridley, with a rough sort of salutation. You bear your wrongs more quietly than I can bear mine. More than that I tell you, and I tell this gentleman and these young ladies, if they are friends of yours, that if I took my wrongs in any other way I should be driven mad. It is only by resenting them and by revenging them in my mind and by angrily demanding the justice I never get that I am able to keep my wits together. It is only that, he said, speaking in a homely, rustic way and with great vehemence. You may tell me that I overexcite myself. I answer that it's in my nature to do it under wrong, and I must do it. There's nothing between doing it and sinking into the smiling state of the poor little mad woman that haunts the court. If I was once to sit down under it, I should become imbecile. The passion and heat in which he was, and the manner in which his face worked, and the violent gestures with which he accompanied what he said were most painful to see. Mr. Jarndyce, he said, consider my case as true as there is a heaven above us. This is my case. I am one of 2 brothers. My father, a farmer, made a will and left his farm and stock and so forth to my mother for her life. After my mother's death, all was to come to me except a legacy of £300 that I was then to pay my brother. My mother died. My brother some time afterwards claimed his legacy. I and some of my relations said that he had a part of it already in board and lodging and some other things now mine. That was the question, and nothing else. No one disputed the will, no one disputed anything but whether part of that £300 had already been paid or not. To settle that question, my brother filing a bill, I was obliged to go into this accursed chancery. I was forced there because the law forced me and would let me go nowhere else. 17 people were made defendants to that simple suit. It first came on after 2 years. It was then stopped for another 2 years while the master, may his head rot off, inquired whether I was my father's son, about which there was no dispute at all with any mortal creature. He then found out that there were not defendants enough. Remember, there were only 17 as yet, but that we must have another who had been left out and must begin all over again. The costs at that time, before the thing was begun, were 3 times the legacy. My brother would have given up the legacy and joyful to escape more costs. My whole estate left to me, and that will of my father's has gone in costs. The suit, still undecided, has fallen into rack and ruin and despair with everything else. And here I stand this day now, Mr. Jarndyce. In your suit there are thousands and thousands involved, wherein mine there are hundreds. Is mine less hard to bear, or is it harder to bear when my whole living was in it and has been thus shamefully sucked away? Mr. Jarndyce said that he condoled with him with all his heart, and that he set up no monopoly himself in being unjustly treated by this monstrous system. There again, said Mr. Gridley, with no diminution of his rage, the system, I am told on all hands. It's the system. I mustn't look to individuals. It's the system. I mustn't go into court and say, "My lord, I beg to know this from you. Is this right or wrong? Have you the face to tell me I have received justice, and therefore am dismissed? My lord knows nothing of it. He sits there to administer the system. I mustn't go to Mr. Tulkinghorn, the solicitor in Lincoln's Inn Fields, and say to him, when he makes me furious, by being so cool and satisfied as they all do, for I know they gain by it while I lose, don't I? I mustn't say to him I will have something out of someone for my ruin by fair means or foul. He is not responsible, it's the system. But if I do no violence to any of them here, I don't know what may happen. If I'm carried beyond myself at last, I will accuse the individual workers of that system against me face to face. Before the great eternal bar, his passion was fearful. I could not have believed in such rage without seeing it. I have done, he said, sitting down and wiping his face. Mr. Jardice, I have done. I am violent. I know I ought to know it. I've been in prison for contempt of court. I've been in prison for threatening the solicitor. I've been in this trouble, and that trouble, and shall be again. I am the man from Shropshire, and I sometimes go beyond amusing them, though they have found it amusing to see me committed into custody and brought up in custody, and all that it would be better for me. They tell me if I restrained myself, I tell them that if I did restrain myself, I should become imbecile. I was a good enough tempered man once. I believe people in my part of the country say they remember me so. But now I must have this vent under my sense of injury, or nothing could hold my wits together. It would be far better for you, Mr. Gridley. The Lord Chancellor told me last week not to waste your time here, and to stay usefully employed down in Shropshire. My lord, I know, would said I to him, and it would have been far better for me never to have heard the name of your high office, but unhappily for me I can't undo the past, and the past drives me here. Besides," he added, breaking fiercely out, "I'll shame them to the last. I'll show myself in that court to its shame. If I knew when I was gonna die and could be carried there, and had a voice to speak with, I would die there, saying, you have brought me here, and sent me from here many, and many a time. Now send me out feet foremost." His countenance had perhaps for years become so set in its contentious expression that it did not soften even now when he was quiet. "I came to take these babies down to my room for an hour," he said, going to them again, "and let them play about. I didn't mean to say all this, but it don't much signify. You're not afraid of me, Tom, are you?" "No," said Tom. "You ain't angry with me. You are right, my child. You're going back. Charlie, I come." Then, little one, he took the youngest child on his arm, where she was willing enough to be carried. "I shouldn't wonder if we found a gingerbread soldier downstairs. Let's go and look for him." He made his former rough salutation, which was not deficient in a certain respect, to Mr. John Dice, and bowing slightly to us, went downstairs to his room. Upon that, Mr. Skimp began to talk for the first time since our arrival in his usual gay strain. He said, "Well, it was really very pleasant to see how things lazily adapted themselves to purposes here. Was this Mr. Gridley a man of a robust will and surprising energy? Intellectually speaking, a sort of inharmonious blacksmith, and he could easily imagine that their Gridley was years ago wandering about in life for something to expend his superfluous combativeness upon a sort of young love among the thorns when the Court of Chancery came in his way, and accommodated him with the exact thing he wanted there. They were matched ever afterwards. Otherwise he might have been a great general blowing up all sorts of towns, or he might have been a great politician dealing in all sorts of parliamentary rhetoric. But as it was, he and the Court of Chancery had fallen upon each other in the pleasantest way, and nobody was much the worse, and Gridley was, so to speak, from that hour provided for. Then look at Cohabbins. How delightfully poor Cohabbins, father of these charming children, illustrated the same principle. He, Mr. Skimley himself, had sometimes repined at the existence of co-advices. He had found co-advices in his way he could have dispensed with co-advices. There had been times when, if he had been a sultan, and his grand vizier had said one morning, "What does the commander of the faithful require at the hands of his slave?" he might have even gone so far as to reply, "The head of co-advices." But what turned out to be the case, that all that time he had been giving employment to a most deserving man, that he had been a benefactor to co-advices, that he had actually been enabling co-advices to bring up these charming children in this agreeable way, developing these social virtues in so much that his heart had just now swelled, and the tears had come into his eyes when he had looked round the room and thought I was the great patron of co-advices, and his little comforts were my work. There was something so captivating in his light way of touching these fantastic strings, and he was such a mirthful child by the side of the graver childhood we had seen that he made my guardian smile even as he turned towards us. From a little private talk with Mrs. Blinder, we kissed Charlie and took her downstairs with us and stopped outside the house to see her run away to her work. I don't know where she was going, but we saw her run, such a little creature in her womanly bonnet and apron, through a covered way at the bottom of the court and melt into the city's strife and sound like a dewdrop in an ocean. Chapter 16. Tom all alone's my lady Dedlock is restless, very restless, the astonished fashionable intelligence hardly knows where to have her today. She is at Chesney Wold. Yesterday she was at her house in town. Tomorrow she may be abroad. For anything the fashionable intelligence can with confidence predict, even Celeste's gallantry has some trouble to keep pace with her. It would have more, but that his other faithful ally, for better and for worse, the gout, darts into the old oak bed chamber at Chesney Wold and grips him by both legs. Celeste receives the gout as a troublesome demon, but still a demon of the patrician order. All the Dedlocks in the direct male line, through a course of time during and beyond which the memory of man goeth not to the contrary, have had the gout. It can be proved, sir, other men's fathers may have died of the rheumatism, or may have taken base contagion from the tainted blood of the sick vulgar, but the Dedlock family have communicated something exclusive even to the leveling process of dying by dying of their own family gout. It has come down through the illustrious line like the plate, or the pictures, or the place in Lincolnshire. It is among their dignities. Celeste is perhaps not wholly without an impression, though he has never resolved it into words, that the angel of death, in the discharge of his necessary duties, may observe to the shades of the aristocracy. My lords and gentlemen, I have the honor to present to you another Dedlock certified to have arrived per the family gout. Hence Celeste yields up his family legs to the family disorder, as if he held his name and fortune on that feudal tenure. He feels that for a Dedlock to be laid upon his back and spasmodically twitched and stabbed in his extremities is a liberty taken somewhere, but he thinks we have all yielded to this. It belongs to us. It has for some hundreds of years been understood that we are not to make the vaults in the park interesting on more ignoble terms, and I submit myself to the compromise, and a goodly show he makes lying in a flush of crimson and gold in the midst of the great drawing room, before his favorite picture of my lady, with broad strips of sunlight shining in down the long perspective through the long line of windows, and alternating with soft reliefs of shadow outside. The stately oaks rooted for ages in the green ground which has never known plowshare, but was still a chase when kings rode to battle with sword and shield and rode a hunting with bow and arrow, bear witness to his greatness inside his forefathers. Looking on him from the wall, say each of us was a passing reality here, and left this colored shadow of himself and melted into remembrance, as dreamy as the distant voices of the rooks now lulling you to rest. And here they are, testimony to his greatness too, and he is very great this day. And woe to Boythorn or other daring wight who shall presumptuously contest an inch with him. My lady is at present represented near Celeste by her portrait. She has flitted away to town with no intention of remaining there, and will soon flirt hither again, to the confusion of the fashionable intelligence. The house in town is not prepared for her reception. It is muffled and dreary. Only one Mercury and powder gapes disconsolate at the hall window, and he mentioned last night to another Mercury of his acquaintance, also accustomed to good society, that if that sort of thing was to last, which it couldn't, for a man of his spirits couldn't bear it, and a man of his figure couldn't be expected to bear it, there would be no resource for him upon his honor but to cut his throat. What connection can there be between the place in Lincolnshire, the house in town, the Mercury in powder, and the whereabouts of Joe the outlaw with the broom, who had that distant ray of light upon him when he swept the churchyard step? What connection can there have been between many people in the innumerable histories of this world who from opposite sides of great gulfs have nevertheless been very curiously brought together? Joe sweeps his crossing all day long, unconscious of the link, if any link there be. He sums up his mental condition when asked a question by replying that he don't know nothing. He knows that it's hard to keep the mud off the crossing in dirty weather, and harder still to live by doing it. Nobody taught him even that much. He found it out. Joe lives, that is to say, Joe has not yet died in a ruinous place known to the like of him by the name of Tom All Alone's. It is a black dilapidated street avoided by all decent people, where the crazy houses were seized upon when their decay was far advanced by some bold vagrants who, after establishing their own possession, took to letting them out in lodgings. Now, these tumbling tenements contain by night a swarm of misery, as on the ruined human wretch vermin parasites appear, so these ruined shelters have bred a crowd of foul existence that crawls in and out of gaps in walls and boards and coils itself to sleep in maggot numbers, where the rain drips in and comes and goes, fetching and carrying fever, and sowing more evil in its every footprint than Lord Coodle and Sir Thomas Doodle and the Duke of Foodle and all the fine gentlemen in office down to Zoodle shall set right in 500 years, though born expressly to do it twice lately. There has been a crash and a cloud of dust like the springing of a mine in Tom All Alone's, and each time a house has fallen, these accidents have made a paragraph in the newspapers and have filled a bed or two in the nearest hospital. The gaps remain, and there are not unpopular lodgings among the rubbish, as several more houses are nearly ready to go. The next crash in Tom All Alone's may be expected to be a good one. This desirable property is in Chancery. Of course, it would be an insult to the discernment of any man with half an eye to tell him so whether Tom is the popular representative of the original plaintiff or defendant and John Dacey, or whether Tom lived here when the suit had laid the street waste all alone until other settlers came to join him, or whether the traditional title is a comprehensive name for a retreat cut off from honest company and put out of the pale of hope. Perhaps nobody knows. Certainly Joe don't know. Well, I don't, says Joe. I don't know nothing. It must be a strange state to be like Joe, to shuffle through the streets unfamiliar with the shapes and in utter darkness as to the meaning of those mysterious symbols so abundant over the shops and at the corners of streets and on the doors and in the windows, to see people read and to see people write and to see the postman deliver letters and not to have the least idea of all that language, to be to every scrap of it stone blind and dumb. It must be very puzzling to see the good company going to the churches on Sundays with their books in their hands, and to think, for perhaps Joe does think at odd times, what does it all mean? And if it means anything to anybody, how comes it that it means nothing to me, to be hustled and jostled and moved on, and really to feel that it would appear to be perfectly true that I have no business here or there or anywhere, and yet to be perplexed by the consideration that I am here somehow too, and everybody overlooked me until I became the creature that I am. It must be a strange state, not merely to be told that I am scarcely human, as in the case of my offering myself for a witness, but to feel it of my own knowledge all my life, to see the horses, dogs, and cattle go by me, and to know that in ignorance I belong to them, and not to the superior beings in my shape, whose delicacy I offend. Joe's ideas of a criminal trial or a judge, or a bishop or a government, or that inestimable jewel to him, if he only knew it. The Constitution should be strange as whole material and immaterial life is wonderfully strange as death. The strangest thing of all, Joe comes out of Tom All Alone's meeting the tardy morning, which is always late in getting down there, and munches his dirty bit of bread as he comes along his way, lying through many streets, and the houses not yet being open. He sits down to breakfast on the doorstep of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, and gives it a brush when he has finished. As an acknowledgement of the accommodation, he admires the size of the edifice and wonders what it's all about. He has no idea, poor wretch, of the spiritual destitution of a coral reef in the Pacific, or what it costs to look up the precious souls among the coconuts and breadfruits. He goes to his crossing and begins to lay it out for the day. The town awakes. The great teetotum is set up for its daily spin, and whirl all that unaccountable reading and writing, which has been suspended for a few hours, recommences. Joe and the other lower animals get on in the unintelligible mess as they can. It is market day. The blinded oxen, goaded, overdriven, never guided, run into wrong places and are beaten out and plunge red-eyed and foaming at stone walls, and often sorely hurt the innocent, and often sorely hurt themselves, very like Joe and his order, very, very like a band of music. Comes and plays. Joe listens to it. So does a dog. A drover's dog waiting for his master outside a butcher's shop and evidently thinking about those sheep he has had upon his mind for some hours and is happily rid of. He seems perplexed. Respecting 3 or 4 can't remember where he left them. Looks up and down the street as half expecting to see them astray. Suddenly pricks up his ears and remembers all about it. A thoroughly vagabond dog accustomed to low company in public houses. A terrific dog to sheep, ready at a whistle to scamper over their backs and tear out mouthfuls of their wool, but an educated, improved, developed dog who has been taught his duties and knows how to discharge them. He and Joe listen to the music, probably with much the same amount of animal satisfaction likewise as to awakened association, aspiration, or regret, melancholy, or joyful reference to things beyond the senses. They are probably upon a par, but otherwise how far above the human listener is the brute turn that dog's descendants wild like Joe, and in a very few years they will so degenerate that they will lose even their bark, but not their bite. The day changes as it wears itself away and becomes dark and drizzly. Joe fights it out at his crossing among the mud and wields the horses' whips and umbrellas and gets but a scanty sum to pay for the unsavory shelter of Tom all alone's twilight. Comes on gas, begins to start up in the shops. The lamp lighter with his ladder runs along the margin of the pavement. A wretched evening is beginning to close in his chambers. Mr. Tulkinghorn sits meditating an application to the nearest magistrate tomorrow morning for a warrant. Gridley, a disappointed suitor, has been here today and has been alarming. We are not to be put in bodily fear, and that ill-conditioned fellow shall be held to bail again from the ceiling for shortened allegory in the person of one impossible wrong upside-down points with the arm of Samson out of joint and an odd one obtrusively toward the window. Why should Mr. Tulkinghorn for no such reason look out of window? Is the hand not always pointing there so he does not look out of window? And if he did, what would it be to see a woman going by? There are women enough in the world, Mr. Tulkinghorn thinks. To many they are at the bottom of all that goes wrong in it, though for the matter of that they create business for lawyers. What would it be to see a woman going by, even though she were going secretly? They are all secret. Mr. Tulkinghorn knows that very well, but they are not all like the woman who now leaves him and his house behind, between whose plain dress and her refined manner there is something exceedingly inconsistent. She should be an upper servant by her attire, yet in her air and step, though both are hurried and assumed as far as she can assume in the muddy streets which she treads with an unaccustomed foot. She is a lady, her face is veiled, and still she sufficiently betrays herself to make more than one of those who pass her look round sharply. She never turns her head. Lady or servant, she has a purpose in her and can follow it. She never turns her head until she comes to the crossing where Joe plies with his broom. He crosses with her and begs. Still she does not turn her head until she has landed on the other side. Then she slightly beckons to him and says, "Come here." Joe follows her a pace or two into a quiet court. "Are you the boy I've read of in the papers?" she asked behind her veil. "I don't know," says Joe, staring moodily at the veil. "Nothing about no papers. I don't know nothing about nothing at all. Were you examined at an inquest?" "I don't know nothing about no." "Where I was took by the beetle, do you mean?" says Joe. "Was the boy's name at the inquest?" Joe: "Yes, that's me," says Joe. "Come farther up." "You mean about a man?" says Joe, following. "Amos was dead." "Hush, speak in a whisper." "Yes." "Did he look, when he was living, so very ill and poor?" "I just," says Joe. "Did he look like?" "Not like you," says the woman with abhorrence. "Ah, not so bad as me," says Joe. "I'm a regular one, I am." "You didn't know him, did you?" "How dare you ask me if I knew him?" "No offense, my lady," says Joe with much humility, for even he has got at the suspicion of her being a lady. "I am not a lady, I am a servant." "You're a jolly servant," says Joe, without the least idea of saying anything offensive, merely as a tribute of admiration. "Listen, and be silent. Don't talk to me, and stand farther from me. Can you show me all those places that were spoken of in the account I read? The place he wrote for, the place he died at, the place where you were taken to, and the place where he was buried. Do you know the place where he was buried?" Joe answers with a nod, having also nodded as each other place was mentioned. "Go before me and show me all those dreadful places. Stop opposite to each, and don't speak to me unless I speak to you. Don't look back. Do what I want, and I will pay you well." Joe attends closely while the words are being spoken tells them off on his broom handle, finding them rather hard, pauses to consider their meaning, considers it satisfactory, and nods his ragged head. "I'm flight," says Joe. "But fen larks, you know, stow ooking it. What does the horrible creature mean?" exclaims the servant, recoiling from him. "Thou cut in a way, you know," says Joe. "I don't understand you. Go on, before I will give you more money than you ever had in your life." Joe screws up his mouth into a whistle, gives his ragged head a rub, takes his broom under his arm, and leads the way, passing deftly with his bare feet over the hard stones and through the mud and mire. Cook's Court. Joe stops, a pause. "Who lives here? In what give him his writing? And give me half a bool," says Joe in a whisper, without looking over his shoulder. "Go on to the next crook's house." Joe stops again, a longer pause. "Who lives here alive, dear?" Joe answers, as before, after a silence. He is asked in which room. "In a back room up there. You can save a window from this corner up there. That's where I see him stretched out. This is the public house where I was took to." Go on to the next. It is a longer walk to the next, but Joe, relieved of his first suspicion, sticks to the forms imposed upon him and does not look round by many devious ways, reeking with offense of many kinds. They come to the little tunnel of a court, and to the gas lamp lighted now, and to the iron gate a west put. "There," says Joe, holding to the bars and looking in, "where, oh, what a scene of horror fair," says Joe, pointing over yonder among em piles of bones, and close to that their kitchen window. "They put him where he never top. They was obliged to stamp upon it. To get it in, I couldn't cover it for you with my broom if a gate was open. That's why they locked it, I suppose," giving it a shake. "It's always locked. Look at the rat," cries Joe, excited. "Oi, look there." He goes into the ground. The servant shrinks into a corner of that hideous archway, with its deadly stains contaminating her dress, and putting out her two hands and passionately telling him to keep away from her, for he is loathsome to her. So remains for some moments. Joe stands staring, and is still staring. When she recovers herself, "Is this place of abomination consecrated ground?" "I don't know nothing of consequential ground," says Joe, still staring. "Is it blessed?" Which, says Joe, in the last degree amazed. "Is it blessed?" "I'm blessed if I know," says Joe, staring more than ever. "But I shouldn't think it weren't blessed," repeats Joe, something troubled in his mind. "It ain't done it much good. If it is blessed, I should think it was troubled myself. But I don't know nothing." The servant takes as little heed of what he says as she seems to take of what she has said herself. She draws off her glove to get some money from her purse. Joe silently notices how white and small her hand is, and what a jolly servant she must be to wear such sparkling rings. She drops a piece of money in his hand without touching it, and shuddering as their hands approach. Now she adds, "Show me the spot again." Joe thrusts the handle of his broom between the bars of the gate, and with his utmost power of elaboration points it out at length. Looking aside to see if he has made himself intelligible, he finds that he is alone. His first proceeding is to hold a piece of money to the gas light, and to be overpowered at finding that it is yellow gold. His next is to give it a one-sided bite at the edge as a test of its quality. His next to put it in his mouth for safety, and to sweep the step and passage with great care. His job done, he sets off for Tom all alone, stopping in the light of innumerable gas lamps to produce the piece of gold and give it another one-sided bite as a reassurance of its being genuine. The mercury in powder is in no want of society tonight, for my lady goes to a grand dinner, and 3 or 4 balls. Celeste is fidgety down at Chesney Wold with no better company than the gout. He complains to Mrs. Ranswell that the rain makes such a monotonous pattering on the terrace that he can't read the paper even by the fireside in his own snug dressing room. Sir Lester would have done better to try the other side of the house, my dear, says Mrs. Rouncewell to Rosa. His dressing room is on my lady's side, and in all these years I never heard the step upon the Ghost's Walk more distinct than it is tonight. Chapter 17. Esther's narrative. Richard very often came to see us while we remained in London, though he soon failed in his letter writing, and with his quick abilities, his good spirits, his good temper, his gaiety and freshness was always delightful. But though I liked him more and more the better I knew him, I still felt more and more how much it was to be regretted that he had been educated in no habits of application and concentration. The system which had addressed him in exactly the same manner as it had addressed hundreds of other boys, all varying in character and capacity, had enabled him to dash through his tasks always with fair credit and often with distinction, but in a fitful, dazzling way that had confirmed his reliance on those very qualities in himself which it had been most desirable to direct and train. They were good qualities, without which no high place can be meritoriously won. But like fire and water, though excellent servants, they were very bad masters. If they had been under Richard's direction, they would have been his friends. But Richard being under their direction, they became his enemies. I write down these opinions not because I believe that this or any other thing was so, because I thought so, but only because I did think so. And I want to be quite candid about all I thought and did. These were my thoughts about Richard. I thought I had often observed besides how right my guardian was in what he had said, and that the uncertainties and delays of the Chancery suit had imparted to his nature something of the careless spirit of a gamester who felt that he was part of a great gaming system. Mr. and Mrs. Bay and Badger coming one afternoon when my guardian was not at home. In the course of conversation, I naturally inquired after Richard. Why, Mr. Carstone, said Mrs. Badger, is very well, and as I assure you a great acquisition to our society. Captain Swartz used to say of me that I was always better than land ahead and a breeze astern to the midshipman's mess when the purser's junk had become as tough as the foretopsail weather earrings. It was his naval way of mentioning generally that I was an acquisition to any society. I may render the same tribute, I am sure, to Mr. Carlstone, but you won't think me premature if I mention it. I said no, as Mrs. Badger's insinuating tone seemed to require such an answer. Nor Miss Clare, said Mrs. Bime Badger sweetly. Ada said no too, and looked uneasy. Why, you see, my dears, said Mrs. Badger, you'll excuse me calling you my dears. We entreated Mrs. Badger not to mention it, because you really are, if I may take the liberty of saying so, pursued Mrs. Badger, so perfectly charming. You see, my dears, that although I am still young, or as Mr. Bam Badger pays me the compliment of saying so. No, Mr. Badger called out like someone contradicting at a public meeting. Not at all. Very well, smiled Mrs. Badger. We will say still young, undoubtedly, said Mr. Badger. My dears, though still young, I have had many opportunities of observing young men. There were many such on board the dear old Crippler. I assure you, after that, when I was with Captain Swartz in the Mediterranean, I embraced every opportunity of knowing and befriending the midshipmen under Captain Swartz's command. You never heard them call the young gentlemen my dears, and probably would not understand allusions to their pipeclay, their weaker guns. But it is otherwise with me, for blue water has been a second home to me, and I have been quite a sailor again, with Professor Dingo, a man of European reputation, murmured Mr. Badger. When I lost my dear first, and became the wife of my dear second, said Mrs. Badger, speaking of her former husbands as if they were parts of a charade, I still enjoyed opportunities of observing youth. The class attendant on Professor Dingo's lectures was a large one, and it became my pride, as the wife of an eminent scientific man seeking herself in science the utmost consolation it could impart, to throw our house open to the students as a kind of scientific exchange. Every Tuesday evening there was lemonade and a mixed biscuit for all who chose to partake of those refreshments, and there was science to an unlimited extent. Remarkable assemblies those, Miss Somerson, said Mr. Badger reverentially. There must have been great intellectual friction going on there under the auspices of such a man. And now, pursued Mrs. Badger, now that I am the wife of my dear third Mr. Badger, I still pursue those habits of observation which were formed during the lifetime of Captain Swassa and adapted to new and unexpected purposes during the lifetime of Professor Dingo. I therefore have not come to the consideration of Mr. Carstone as a neophyte, and yet I am very much of the opinion, my dears, that he has not chosen his profession advisedly. Ada looked so very anxious now that I asked Mrs. Badger on what she found in her supposition. My dear Miss Sampson, she replied, on Mr. Carstone's character and conduct. He is of such a very easy disposition that probably he would never think it worthwhile to mention how he really feels, but he feels languid about the profession. He has not that positive interest in it which makes it his vocation. If he has any decided impression in reference to it, I should say it was that it is a tiresome pursuit. Now, this is not promising. Young men like Mr. Allen Woodcourt, who take it from a strong interest in all that it can do, will find some reward in it, through a great deal of work for a very little money, and through years of considerable endurance and disappointment. But I am quite convinced that this would never be the case with Mr. Carlstone. Does Mr. Badger think so too? Asked Ada timidly. Why, said Mr. Badger, to tell the truth, Miss Claire, this view of the matter had not occurred to me until Mrs. Badger mentioned it. But when Mrs. Badger put it in that light, I naturally gave great consideration to it, knowing that Mrs. Badger's mind, in addition to its natural advantages, has had the rare advantage of being formed by to such very distinguished, I will even say illustrious public men as Captain Swallows of the Royal Navy and Professor Dingo. The conclusion at which I have arrived is, in short, is Mrs. Badger's conclusion. It was a maxim of Captain Swartz's, said Mrs. Badger, speaking in his figurative naval manner, that when you make pitch hot you cannot make it to hot, and that if you only have to swab a plank you should swab it as if David Jones were after you. It appears to me that this maxim is applicable to the medical as well as to the nautical profession, to all professions, observed Mr. Badger. It was admirably said by Captain Swowser, beautifully said. People objected to Professor Dingo when we were staying in the north of Devon after our marriage, said Mrs. Badger, that he disfigured some of the houses and other buildings by chipping off fragments of those edifices with his little geological hammer. But the professor replied that he knew of no building save the Temple of Science. The principle is the same. I think precisely the same, said Mr. Badger, finally expressed. The professor made the same remark, Miss Summerson, in his last illness, when his mind wandering he insisted on keeping his little hammer under the pillow and chipping at the countenances of the attendants. The ruling passion, although we could have dispensed with the length at which Mr. and Mrs. Badger pursued the conversation, we both felt that it was disinterested in them to express the opinion they had communicated to us, and that there was a great probability of its being sound. We agreed to say nothing to Mr. Jarndyce until we had spoken to Richard, and as he was coming next evening we resolved to have a very serious talk with him. So after he had been a little while with Ada, I went in and found my darling, as I knew she would be, prepared to consider him thoroughly right in whatever he said. And how do you get on, Richard, said I. I always sat down on the other side of him. He made quite a sister of me. Oh, well enough, said Richard. He can't say better than that, Esther. Can he? Cried my pet triumphantly. I tried to look at my pet in the wisest manner, but of course I couldn't. Well enough, I repeated. Yes, said Richard, well enough. It's rather jog-trotty and humdrum, but it'll do as well as anything else. Oh, my dear Richard, the first remonstrated. What's the matter, said Richard. Do as well as anything else. I don't think there's any harm in that, Dame Durton, said Ada, looking so confidingly at me across him. Because if it will do as well as anything else, it will do very well, I hope. Oh yes, I hope so, returned Richard, carelessly tossing his hair from his forehead. After all, it may only be a kind of probation to our suit. I forgot, though, I am not to mention the suit Forbidden's ground. Oh yes, it's all right enough. Let us talk about something else. Ada would have done so willingly and with a full persuasion that we had brought the question to a most satisfactory state, but I thought it would be useless to stop there, so I began again. No, but Richard, said I, and my dear Ada, consider how important it is to you both, and what a point of honor it is towards your cousin, that you, Richard, should be quite in earnest without any reservation. I think we had better talk about this, really, Ada. It will be too late very soon. Oh yes, we must talk about it, said Ada, but I think Richard is right. What was the use of my trying to look wise when she was so pretty and so engaging and so fond of him? Mr. and Mrs. Badger were here yesterday, Richard, said I, and they seemed disposed to think that you had no great liking for the profession. Did they, though, said Richard. Oh well, that rather alters the case, because I had no idea that they thought so, and I should not have liked to disappoint or inconvenience them. The fact is, I don't care much about it, but oh, it don't matter, it'll do as well as anything else, you hear, Maida, said I. The fact is, Richard proceeded half thoughtfully and half jocosely, it is not quite in my way. I don't take to it, and I get too much of Mrs. Bay and Badger's first and second. I am sure that's very natural, cried Ada, quite delighted. The very thing we both said yesterday, Esther, then pursued Richard. It's monotonous, and today is to like yesterday, and tomorrow is to like today. But I am afraid, said I, this is an objection to all kinds of application to life itself, except under some very uncommon circumstances. Do you think so? Returned Richard, still considering perhaps how. Why then, you know, he added, suddenly becoming gay again, we travel outside a circle to what I said just now. It'll do as well as anything else. Oh, it's all right enough. Let us talk about something else. But even Ada, with her loving face, and if it had seemed innocent and trusting when I first saw it in that memorable November fog, how much more did it seem now when I knew her innocent and trusting heart. Even Ada shook her head at this and looked serious, so I thought it a good opportunity to hint to Richard that if he was sometimes a little careless of himself, I was very sure he never meant to be careless of Ada, and that it was a part of his affectionate consideration for her not to slight the importance of a step that might influence both their lives. This made him almost grave. "My dear Mother Hubbard," he said, "that's the very thing. I have thought of that several times and have been quite angry with myself for meaning to be so much in earnest and somehow not exactly being so. I don't know how it is. I seem to want something or other to stand by. Even you have no idea how fond I am of Ada, my darling cousin. I love you so much, but I don't settle down to constancy and other things. It's such uphill work and it takes such a time," said Richard with an air of vexation. "That maybe I suggested because you don't like what you have chosen." "Poor fellow," said Ada. "I'm sure I don't wonder at it. No, it was not of the least use my trying to look wise. I tried again. But how could I do it, or how could it have any effect if I could?" While Ada rested her clasped hands upon his shoulder, and while he looked at her tender blue eyes, and while they looked at him, "You see, my precious girl," said Richard, passing her golden curls through and through his hand, "I was a little hasty perhaps, or I misunderstood my own inclinations. Perhaps they don't seem to lie in that direction. I couldn't tell till I tried. Now the question is whether it's worthwhile to undo all that has been done. It seems like making a great disturbance about nothing particular." "My dear Richard," said I, "how can you say about nothing particular?" "I don't mean absolutely that," he returned. "I mean that it may be nothing particular, because I may never want it both." "Ada," and I urged in reply, "not only that it was decidedly worthwhile to undo what had been done, but that it must be undone." I then asked Richard whether he had thought of any more congenial pursuit there. "My dear Mrs. Shipton," said Richard, "you touch me home." "Yes, I have been thinking that the law is the boy for me." "The law," repeated Ada, as if she were afraid of the name. "If I went into Kenji's office," said Richard, "and if I were placed under articles to Kenji, I should have my eye on the forbidden's ground, and should be able to study it and master it, and to satisfy myself that it was not neglected and was being properly conducted. I should be able to look after Ada's interests and my own interests the same thing, and I should peg away at Blackstone and all those fellows with the most tremendous ardor." I was not by any means so sure of that, and I saw how his hankering after the vague things yet to come of those long-deferred hopes cast a shade on Ada's face. But I thought it best to encourage him in any project of continuous exertion, and only advised him to be quite sure that his mind was made up. "Now, my dear Minerva," said Richard, "I am as steady as you are. I made a mistake. We're all liable to mistakes. I won't do so any more, and I'll become such a lawyer as is not often seen. That is, you know," said Richard, relapsing into doubt, "if it really is worthwhile after all to make such a disturbance about nothing particular." This led to our saying again, with a great deal of gravity, all that we had said already, and to our coming to much the same conclusion afterwards. But we so strongly advised Richard to be frank and open with Mr. Jarndyce without a moment's delay, and his disposition was naturally so opposed to concealment that he sought him out at once, taking us with him, and made a full avowal. "Rick," said my guardian, after hearing him attentively, "we can retreat with honor, and we will, but we must be careful. For our cousin's sake, Rick, for our cousin's sake, that we make no more such mistakes. Therefore, in the matter of the law, we will have a good trial before we decide. We will look before we leap, and take plenty of time about it." Richard's energy was of such an impatient and fitful kind that he would have liked nothing better than to have gone to Mr. Kenji's office in that hour, and to have entered into articles with him on the spot, submitting, however, with a good grace to the caution that we had shown to be so necessary. He contented himself with sitting down among us in his lightest spirits, and talking as if his one unvarying purpose in life from childhood had been that one which now held possession of him. My guardian was very kind and cordial with him, but rather grave enough so to cause Ada, when he had departed, and we were going upstairs to bed, to say, "Cousin John, I hope you don't think the worse of Richard." "No, my love," said he, because it was very natural that Richard should be mistaken in such a difficult case. "It is not uncommon." "No, no, my love," said he, "don't look unhappy." "Oh, I am not unhappy, Cousin John. said Ada, smiling cheerfully with her hand upon his shoulder where she had put it in, bidding him good night. "But I should be a little so if you thought it all the worse of Richard, my dear," said Mr. Jarndyce. "I should think the worse of him only if you were ever in the least unhappy through his means. I should be more disposed to quarrel with myself even than with poor Rick, for I brought you together. But Tata, this is nothing, he has time before him, and the race to run. I think the worse of him, not I, my loving cousin, and not you, I swear." "No, indeed, Cousin John," said Ada, "I am sure I could not. I am sure I would not think any ill of Richard if the whole world did. I could, and I would think better of him then than at any other time." So quietly and honestly she said it, with her hands upon his shoulders, both hands now, and looking up into his face like the picture of truth. "I think," said my guardian thoughtfully regarding her, "I think it must be somewhere written that the virtues of the mothers shall occasionally be visited on the children, as well as the sins of the father. Good night, my rosebud, good night, little woman, pleasant slumbers, happy dreams." This was the first time I ever saw him follow Ada, with his eyes with something of a shadow on their benevolent expression. I well remember the look with which he had contemplated her and Richard when she was singing in the firelight. It was but a very little while since he had watched them passing down the room in which the sun was shining and away into the shade, but his glance was changed, and even the silent look of confidence in me which now followed it once more was not quite so hopeful and untroubled as it had originally been. Ada praised Richard more to me that night than she had ever praised him, yet she went to sleep with a little bracelet he had given her clasped upon her arm. I fancied she was dreaming of him when I kissed her cheek after she had slept an hour, and saw how tranquil and happy she looked, for I was so little inclined to sleep myself that night that I sat up working. It would not be worth mentioning for its own sake, but I was wakeful and rather low-spirited. I don't know why, at least I don't think I know why, at least perhaps I do, but I don't think it matters. At any rate, I made up my mind to be so dreadfully industrious that I would leave myself not a moment's leisure to be low-spirited, for I naturally, said Esther, you, to be low-spirited, you. And it really was time to say so, for yes, I really did see myself in the glass, almost crying, as if you had anything to make you unhappy instead of everything to make you happy, you ungrateful heart, said I. If I could have made myself go to sleep, I would have done it directly, but not being able to do that, I took out of my basket some ornamental work for our house, I mean Bleak House, that I was busy with at that time, and sat down to it with great determination. It was necessary to count all the stitches in that work, and I resolved to go on with it until I couldn't keep my eyes open, and then to go to bed. I soon found myself very busy, but I had left some silk downstairs in a worktable drawer in the temporary growlery, and coming to a stop for want of it, I took my candle and went softly down to get it. To my great surprise, on going in, I found my guardian still there, and sitting looking at the ashes. He was lost in thought. His book lay unheeded by his side. His silvered iron-gray hair was scattered confusedly upon his forehead, as though his hand had been wandering among it while his thoughts were elsewhere, and his face looked worn, almost frightened by coming upon him so unexpectedly. I stood still for a moment, and should have retired without speaking, had he not, in again passing his hand abstractedly through his hair, seen me and started. Esther, I told him what I had come for at work so late. My dear, I am working late tonight, said I, because I couldn't sleep and wished to tire myself. But dear guardian, you are late too, and look weary. You have no trouble, I hope, to keep you waking? None, little woman, that you would readily understand, said he. He spoke in a regretful tone, so new to me that I inwardly repeated, as if that would help me to his meaning, that I could readily understand. Remain a moment, Esther, said he. You were in my thoughts. I hope I was not the trouble, guardian. He slightly waved his hand and fell into his usual manner. The change was so remarkable, and he appeared to make it by dint of so much self-command, that I found myself again inwardly repeating, none that I could understand. Little woman, said my guardian, I was thinking that, as I have been thinking since I have been sitting here, that you ought to know of your own history. All I know, it is very little, next to nothing, dear guardian, I replied, when you spoke to me before on that subject. But since then, he gravely interposed, anticipating what I meant to say. I have reflected that your having anything to ask me and my having anything to tell you are different considerations. Esther, it is Perhaps my duty to impart to you the little I know. If you think so, guardian, it is right, I think so, he returned very gently and kindly and very distinctly. My dear, I think so now. If any real disadvantage can attach to your position in the mind of any man or woman worth of thought, it is right that you, at least of all the world, should not magnify it to yourself by having vague impressions of its nature. I sat down and said, after a little effort, to be as calm as I ought to be. One of my earliest remembrances, guardian, is of these words: your mother Esther is your disgrace, and you were hers. The time will come, and soon enough, when you will understand this better, and will feel it too, as no one save a woman can. I had covered my face with my hands in repeating the words, but I took them away now with a better kind of shame, I hope, and told him that to him I owed the blessing that I had from my childhood to that hour. Never felt it. He put up his hand as if to stop me. I well knew that he was never to be thanked, and said no more. 9 years, my dear, he said, after thinking for a little while, have passed since I received a letter from a lady living in seclusion, written with a stern passion and power that rendered it unlike all other letters I have ever read. It was written to me, as it told me, in so many words, perhaps because it was the writer's idiosyncrasy to put that trust in me, perhaps because it was mine to justify it. It told me of a child, an orphan girl then 12 years old, and some such cruel words as those which live in your remembrance. It told me that the writer had bred her in secrecy from her birth, had blotted out all trace of her existence, and that if the writer were to die before the child became a woman, she would be left entirely friendless, nameless, and unknown. It asked me to consider if I would in that case finish what the writer had begun. I listened in silence and looked attentively at him. Your early recollection, my dear, will supply the gloomy medium through which all this was seen and expressed by the writer, and the distorted religion which clouded her mind with impressions of the need there was for the child to expiate an offense of which she was quite innocent. I felt concern for the little creature in her darkened life, and replied to the letter. I took his hand and kissed it. It laid the injunction on me that I should never propose to see the writer, who had long been estranged from all intercourse with the world, but who would see a confidential agent if I would appoint one. I accredited Mr. Kenge, the lady said of her own accord, and not of his seeking, that her name was an assumed one, that she was, if there were any ties of blood in such a case, the child's aunt, that more than this she would never, and he was well persuaded of the steadfastness of her resolution for any human consideration disclose. My dear, I have told you all. I held his hand for a little while in mine. I saw my ward oftener than she saw me, he added cheerily, making light of it, and I always knew she was beloved, useful, and happy. She repays me 20,000-fold, and 20 more to that every hour and every day, and often as still said I, she blesses the guardian who is a father to her. At the word father I saw his former trouble come into his face,